Imagine you've scored an invite to the most exclusive party in Athens. You're dressed to impress in your sharpest linen tunic and perfectly strapped sandals. You're ready to rub elbows with powerful senators or listen to war stories from guys who claim they've fought mythical beasts. But the second you step through the door, the chill vibe disappears. This isn't a modern house party where you can just grab a drink and blend in. You have just entered the symposium, a world where every move you make is judged. From how you hold your cup to how well you handle your wine, you are under a microscope. In this room, the social rules are tighter than airport security. If you mess up, you don't just feel embarrassed. You risk being branded as a barbarian in front of the city's most powerful people. Modern parties are defined by their unstructured chaos. We drift through kitchens and fight over playlists, valuing the chill and the casual. By contrast, a Greek gathering was an intentional performance. Every seat was assigned, every drink was measured, and every word was a calculated move. It was a test of discipline, where even the fun was a high-stakes ritual. First off, let's talk about the layout. You aren't standing. Standing was for servants and people who couldn't afford furniture. You were reclining. The Greeks had a dedicated room for this, called the andron, which was essentially a man cave, but with more marble and significantly less drywall. You'd sprawl out on a kleina, sort of upholstered, couch, usually sharing it with another guy. It's like a very fancy, very crowded slumber party, where everyone is wearing a sheet. If you've ever complained about a lack of legroom on a budget flight, you aren't ready for the physical intimacy of an Athenian Tuesday night. Before the drinking even starts, there's a whole legal proceeding to determine how drunk everyone is going to get. This wasn't left to chance. You didn't just see where the night takes us. No, the group elected a symposiarch, or the master of the drink. Think of him as a mix between a party captain and a benevolent dictator. His job was to decide the mixing ratio of wine to water, because drinking straight wine was considered something only barbarians did. If you drank your wine neat, the Greeks looked at you the way we look at someone who eats a raw onion in public. It was seen as savage, dangerous, and likely to make you start a fight with a statue. Usually, it was 3 parts water to 1 part wine. It was essentially alcoholic-flavored water, designed to keep you in that sweet spot of enlightened buzz for as long as possible. The master of the drink would also set the theme for the night's conversation. Imagine walking into a house party today, and the host says, "Welcome. Tonight's mandatory topic of discussion is the nature of the soul and whether justice is an inherent truth or a social construct. Also, there are no chairs. Get on the floor." You'd leave. You'd call an Uber immediately. But for the Greeks, this was the peak of entertainment. You were expected to contribute. You had to be witty. You had to quote Homer from memory like it was a TikTok sound. If you didn't have a hot take on whether love is a divine madness or just a chemical imbalance, you were basically the guy at the party who just stands near the dog. And then there was the kotobos. This is the part where the Greeks proved they were just as messy as us, just with better PR. Kotobos was a drinking game that involved taking the dregs of your wine, the nasty, yeasty bits at the bottom, and flicking them across the room at a target, usually a bronze disc or a floating bowl. Imagine a room full of the world's greatest philosophers, men who literally invented logic and geometry, trying to snort laugh while flicking wine sludge at a metal plate to see who could make the loudest clang. It was essentially beer pong, but with more toga slips and a much higher chance of ruining the hostess' expensive rugs. But there was a dark side to the fun. The symposium was a gated community. If you weren't a free, adult male citizen, you weren't on the guest list. Women were only allowed in if they were hetero-high-end companions who were educated, talented, and paid to be there. They were the only ones allowed to have an opinion, play the flute, and keep the conversation from devolving into a bunch of guys arguing about who has the best olive grove. For the respectable wives of the men in the room, the symposium was a loud noise happening behind a closed door while they were relegated to the upstairs quarters. As the night wore on, the master of the drink might decide to increase the wine-to-water ratio. This is when the philosophy started to get a bit blurry. The Greeks had a very specific word for the transition from a civilized gathering to a drunken riot: hubris. Once the flutes got louder and the kotobo's targets started looking like double visions, the symposium often spilled out into the streets as a como. This was a ritualized, drunken procession where a bunch of elites would stumble through the dark, singing songs, wearing flower crowns, and generally being a nuisance to anyone trying to get their 8 hours of segmented sleep. It was the original pub crawl, but with a higher chance of someone writing an epic poem about it the next morning. So, the next time you're at a party and you feel awkward because you don't know anyone, just be glad you don't have to elect a dictator to decide how much water goes in your seltzer. And you definitely don't have to explain the metaphysical properties of the good while lying sideways on a couch with a stranger's elbow in your ribs. The Greeks had a rule for everything, even for how to lose your mind. Since we've survived the drunken philosophy of the symposium, let's dive into the place where the Greeks really went over the top. If you think your local gym is intimidating because of the loud grunting and the smell of rubber mats, you clearly haven't stepped foot in an ancient Greek gymnasium. In the modern world, the gym is a place where you wear moisture-wicking leggings, plug in noise-canceling headphones, and pray no one tries to make eye contact with you while you're on the elliptical. In ancient Greece, the gym was a social, political, and educational hub where privacy went to die and clothing was considered an unnecessary distraction. First, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of outfits in the room. The word gymnasium literally comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. This wasn't a suggestion, it was the dress code. The Greeks believed that the human body was a masterpiece of geometry and divine favor, and covering it up with a tunic while you were trying to throw a discus was basically an insult to the gods and your own hamstrings. Imagine walking into a modern-day gym and everyone from the front desk staff to the guy on the bench press is just there. Full display. No pockets for your phone, no place to hide a bad tan line. Just a sea of glistening, uninhibited skin. But it wasn't just about being naked. It was about being shiny. The Greeks didn't have deodorant, but they did have an obsession with olive oil. Before you started your workout, you didn't put on a sweatband. You slathered yourself in oil from head to toe. This served a few purposes. It protected your skin from the sun, since most gyms were outdoor courtyards. It made you harder to grab during wrestling matches, and it ensured that everyone looked like a well-dressed salad. If you've ever slipped on a wet floor, imagine trying to grapple with a man who is essentially a human slip-and-slide. The social rules of the gym were as rigid as the muscles they were trying to build. You didn't just go there to lift heavy things. You went there to be seen. The gym was where the elite youth of the city the ephebs trained to be soldiers and citizens. It was also where older men, the erasti, hung around to mentor the younger ones. This was the social networking site of the ancient world. You didn't scroll through LinkedIn. You leaned against a marble pillar, covered in oil and dust, and debated the finer points of Athenian foreign policy with a guy who just finished a 3-hour wrestling set. Now, let's talk about hygiene, or the lack thereof. After you were done wrestling in a sandpit while covered in oil, you didn't just hop in a pressurized shower with eucalyptus-scented body wash. No, you used a strigil. This was a curved metal scraping tool. You would stand there and literally scrape the mixture of oil, sweat, and sand off your body. This sludge was actually a hot commodity. In a move that would make a modern skincare influencer faint, the scraped-off gunk known as glowios was sometimes collected and sold as a medical ointment. People genuinely believed that the sweat of a champion athlete contained healing properties. So, if you ever feel gross about sharing a yoga mat, just remember that your ancestors were potentially rubbing athlete sweat sludge on their sore throats. The atmosphere was a chaotic blend of a college campus, a military barracks, and a high-end spa. There were dedicated areas for wrestling, the palestra, running tracks, and shaded walkways where philosophers like Plato and Aristotle would pace back and forth, teaching students while everyone around them was grunt-lifting stones. It was the only place on earth where you could get a world-class education in metaphysics while being accidentally hit in the face by a stray javelin. There was also a massive emphasis on kallikatothia, the idea that a beautiful body and a virtuous soul were two sides of the same coin. If you weren't fit, the Greeks assumed your personality was also probably a bit flabby. There was a huge amount of social pressure to look like a statue. If you showed up to the gym with a dad bod, you weren't just out of shape, you were failing your civic duty. The Greeks looked at unathletic people with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if a lack of abs was a sign that you couldn't be trusted with a secret or a government position. Training was brutal and often involved pankration, which was essentially MMA, but with fewer rules and more permanent injuries. The only things you weren't allowed to do were eye gouging and biting. Everything else, breaking fingers, choking, kicking, was fair game. And remember, they were doing this while covered in oil. It was less of a sport and more of a test to see who could survive the afternoon without a trip to the local healer. As the sun began to set, the gym would transform into a lounge. After the scraping and the sludge collection, the men would gather in the baths. This wasn't a quick rinse, it was a communal experience. You'd sit around in steam rooms or cold plunges, discussing who won the day's sprint and which politician was currently losing his mind. It was the ultimate boys' club, a place where the social hierarchy was reinforced through physical prowess and the ability to quote poetry while dripping wet. So, the next time you re-annoyed that the gym is too crowded or someone didn't wipe down the bench, just take a deep breath. At least you aren't being scraped with a metal hook by a stranger. You aren't being sold as a topical ointment. And you definitely don't have to debate the meaning of the infinite while someone tries to snap your collarbone in a sentence. The Greek gym was a place of high ideals and very, very high levels of body oil. Moving from the glistening, oil-slicked chaos of the gymnasium to the home might sound like a relief, but in ancient Greece, the comfort of your own home was more like a last-aches domestic prison. In the modern world, your home is your sanctuary. It's where you kick off your shoes, order pizza, and ignore the rest of the world while you binge-watch something mindless. But if you were living in an ancient Greek, oikos, the household, your home was not a place to relax. To relax, it was a highly regulated social unit where every room had a gender, and your primary job was to make sure the family bloodline did not accidentally implode. First, let's talk about the architecture of stay over there. If you were a woman in a respectable Athenian household, you didn't just wander around the house like you owned the place, even if you technically did. Homes were strictly divided into the andron, the men's quarters we saw during the symposium, and the gynekon, the women's quarters. The gynekon was usually located on the upper floor or the furthest, most inconvenient corner of the house. It wasn't just a bedroom, it was a fortress. The idea was to keep the women of the house away from the eyes of any visiting men. If a male guest came over for dinner, the women disappeared like they were part of a witness protection program. Now, let's talk about the dating scene, which is a generous term for what was essentially a business merger involving a teenager and a man twice her age. In today's world, we complain about ghosting or bad Tinder bios. In ancient Greece, dating consisted of your father having a very intense conversation with another man over some diluted wine and deciding that yes, you would be a great addition to his estate. The bride was usually around 14 or 15, while the groom was often in his 30s. Imagine being a high school freshman and being told you moving in with a 35-year-old guy who spends all day at the gym talking about the truth. It wasn't a romance, it was a transfer of property. The wedding itself was less fairy tale and more legal kidnapping. The groom would literally drive a chariot to the bride's house, pick her up, and drive her to his home in a torchlit procession while people threw nuts and dried fruit at them. This wasn't a fun tradition. It was a symbolic, you live here now ceremony. Once she crossed the threshold, the bride ceased to be part of her father's family and became the property of her husband, oikos. Her job description was simple: produce a male heir and don't let the wool get dusty. If you think your to-do list is stressful, the Greek housewife's daily grind was a marathon of textile production. A respectable woman spent her life at the loom. If a man walked into a house and didn't hear the constant clack-clack-clack of weaving, he'd probably assume the family was spiraling into moral decay. Weaving wasn't a hobby, it was how the family got clothes. Everything from the tunics to the bedsheets had to be made by hand. It was the original slow fashion, but with 100% more social pressure and 0 Instagram likes. And then there were the social rules for being outside, which for a woman were basically don't. A respectable woman was expected to stay indoors as much as possible. If she had to go out, say, for a religious festival, or to fetch water, if the family was Porsche, had to be veiled and accompanied by a servant. If a woman was seen walking alone in the street, the neighbors didn't think, oh, she's getting some fresh air. They thought, something has gone terribly wrong with that family's management. To be well known was the ultimate insult for a Greek woman. The goal was for no man outside your family to even know your name. For the men, the home was essentially a place to sleep and store your stuff while you spent the rest of your life at the agora, the market, or the gymnasium. A man's social status was tied to how well he managed his oikos, but he didn't actually want to be in it. Being a homebody in ancient Greece wasn't a personality trait. It was a sign that you were probably a bit weird or lacked the masculine drive to go argue about taxes in public. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Slavery was the backbone of the Greek household. meaning there were always people around who were technically part of the family but had zero rights. Your private conversations were heard by servants. Your private moments were witnessed by the family's livestock, and your private business was basically the neighborhood's morning news. Finally, let's talk about the head of the house, the Kyrios. This guy had absolute legal power. He decided who his daughters married. He could disown his sons if they were particularly annoying, and he was the only one who could represent the family in court. He was the CEO, the HR department, and the Supreme Court, all rolled into one bearded man in a toga. So, the next time you re-annoyed that your roommate left a dish in the sink, or your partner is hogging the remote, just remember, at least you are unconfined to a second-story room, weaving a cloak for a man twice your age who you met 3 days ago at a chariot-based kidnapping. The ancient Greek home was a place of order, spinning wheels, and a complete, intentional lack of fun. Since we've managed to survive the stifling silence of the household, it's time to head into the absolute sensory overload of the agora. If the house was a prison of boredom, the agora was a circus of ego, commerce, and people shouting about fish. In the modern world, if you need a loaf of bread and a new pair of shoes, you go to a supermarket or click a button on your phone while lying in bed. It's quiet, it's efficient, and you don't have to talk to a single soul if you don't want to. But in ancient Greece, going to the shops was a high-stakes performance art piece. The agora was the heart of the city, a sprawling open-air market that was equal parts shopping mall, political stage, and the world's most aggressive comment section. First, let's talk about the demographic. If you walked into the Athenian agora at 10 o'clock a.m., you would notice one thing immediately. It was a sea of beards. Unless you were a slave fetching water or a very specific type of street vendor, the agora was a men-only club. Respectable women wouldn't be caught dead here. If a woman of status showed up to browse the pottery aisle, it would be the equivalent of a modern celebrity walking into a dive bar at 3 o'clock a.m. Everyone would stare, and the tabloids or the local gossips at the barber shop would have a field day. Shopping wasn't just about buying things. It was about the hustle. There were no fixed prices, no clearance stickers, no buy one get one free promotions, unless you were prepared to argue for 45 minutes. Every single transaction was a verbal wrestling match. If you walked up to a fishmonger and just paid the first price he quoted, he wouldn't think you were a great customer. He'd think you were an idiot. He might even be offended that you didn't give him the chance to lie to your face about how fresh the sea bass was. The fishmongers, by the way, were the legendary villains of the agora. Ancient comic poets wrote about them the way we write about greedy tech billionaires. They were famous for being rude, overcharging, and using tricks to make their fish look better, like hitting a drum to startle the customers so they would notice the fish was actually 3 days old and starting to smell like a gym locker. There was even a law in some cities that fishmongers couldn't sit down while selling, because if they sat, they'd get too comfortable and scam people even more efficiently. Imagine a world where the guy at the deli counter has to stand on one leg just so he doesn't have the leverage to overcharge you for ham. But the agora wasn't just for food. It was organized into circles or sections. You had the poultry section, the slave market, a grim reminder that Greek freedom was very selective, and the Syrian, which was the place for gambling. If you wanted to lose your life savings on a dice game or a cockfight, this was your spot. And because the Greeks loved a good social hierarchy, where you shopped said a lot about who you were. Buying high-end perfume. You're a dandy. Buying cheap saltfish. You're probably struggling. Buying a philosopher. Well, you're just showing off. Around the edges of the market were the stowers' long shaded porches with columns. This is where the real business happened. This was the LinkedIn of the 4th century BC. If you were a lawyer, a politician, or a philosopher, you didn't have an office with a mahogany desk and a succulent. You had a spot under a stoa. You'd stand there, looking busy, waiting for someone to come by so you could explain why your theory on the prime mover was superior to the guy 3 pillars down. This is also where the sycophants lived. In modern English, a sycophant is a but in ancient Greece, they were much worse. They were professional lawsuit bringers. Athens was a notoriously litigious society. People sued each other for fun, for profit, and for spite. If you were walking through the agora and looked at someone the wrong way, a sycophant might pop out from behind a statue and inform you that you were being sued for impiety or damaging the public vibe. It was like living in a world where everyone is an unlicensed process server looking for a payday. And then there was the gossip. The Greeks had a specific word for the people who hung around the barber shops and perfume stalls just to trade rumors. Peripedikoi. They were the human version of a trending sidebar. If a general was having an affair, if a senator was secretly in debt, or if someone's goat had given birth to a 2-headed kid, the agora knew within 20 minutes. Privacy was a foreign concept. If you whispered something in the agora, you might as well have shouted it from the top of the Parthenon. The noise must have been incredible. You had blacksmiths hammering, vendors screaming about the price of onions, philosophers shouting about the allegory of the cave, and the constant clatter of wooden coins. The Greeks didn't use paper money. They used obols and drachmas, heavy silver or bronze coins that people often carried inside their mouths because tunics didn't have pockets. Yes, you read that right. If you wanted to buy a cabbage, you'd spit the payment into the vendor's hand. It gives a whole new meaning to dirty money and explains why the Greeks were so obsessed with hygiene everywhere else their currency was a biological hazard. By noon, the high market was over. The heat would become unbearable. The fish would start to turn, and the crowds would thin out. The men would head back to their gyms or their symposia, leaving the agora to the scavengers and the cleanup crews. So, the next time you're annoyed that the self-checkout machine is unexpectedly calling for assistance, just remember, at least you didn't have to carry your credit card under your tongue. You didn't have to engage in a 30-minute debate about the ethics of sea bass. And nobody tried to sue you for vibe theft on your way to the exit. The agora was the birthplace of democracy, but it was also the birthplace of the world's most stressful shopping experience. Since we've managed to survive the aggressive sales tactics and mouth-stored currency of the marketplace, it's time to face the ultimate Greek boss fight, the legal system. In ancient Greece, justice wasn't a blindfolded lady with a scale. It was 500 angry guys with a grudge and a handful of voting discs. In the modern world, if you get sued or accused of a crime, you hire a lawyer, a person who has spent 7 years studying tiny Latin words so they can argue on your behalf while you sit quietly and try to look innocent. But in ancient Athens, having a lawyer was actually illegal. You had to represent yourself. Imagine standing in front of a crowd of hundreds, facing a charge of impiety or stealing a neighbor's prize olive tree, and your only defense is your own ability to keep a crowd entertained. It wasn't a trial. It was a televised talent show where the prize was not being executed. First, let's talk about the jury. In a modern court, you have 12 people who are usually trying their best to stay awake. In Athens, the standard jury size was 501 people, because there were no professional judges to tell the jury what the law actually meant. The trial was 100% a popularity contest. The goal wasn't necessarily to prove you were innocent. The goal was to make the jury like you more than the other guy. This led to some of the most shameless tactics in human history. It was perfectly standard to bring your crying children, your aging mother, and your war-wounded cousin into court to stand behind you and sob while you gave your speech. You weren't presenting evidence. You were weaponizing pity. Now, let's talk about hygiene, or the lack thereof. After you were done wrestling in a sandpit while covered in oil, you didn't just hop in a pressurized shower with eucalyptus-scented body wash. No, you used a strigil. This was a curved metal scraping tool. You would stand there and literally scrape the mixture of oil, sweat, and sand off your body. This sludge was actually a hot commodity. In a move that would make a modern skincare influencer faint, the scraped-off gunk known as glowios was sometimes collected and sold as a medical ointment. People genuinely believed that the sweat of a champion athlete contained healing properties. So, if you ever feel gross about sharing a yoga mat, just remember that your ancestors were potentially rubbing athlete sweat sludge on their sore throats. The atmosphere was a chaotic blend of a college campus, a military barracks, and a high-end spa. There were dedicated areas for wrestling, the palestra, running tracks, and shaded walkways where philosophers like Plato and Aristotle would pace back and forth, teaching students while everyone around them was grunt-lifting stones. It was the only place on earth where you could get a world-class education in metaphysics while being accidentally hit in the face by a stray javelin. There was also a massive emphasis on kallikotauthia, the idea that a beautiful body and a virtuous soul were two sides of the same coin. If you weren't fit, the Greeks assumed your personality was also probably a bit flabby. There was a huge amount of social pressure to look like a statue. If you showed up to the gym with a dad bod, you weren't just out of shape, you were failing your civic duty. The Greeks looked at unathletic people with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if a lack of abs was a sign that you couldn't be trusted with a secret or a government position. Training was brutal and often involved pankration, which was essentially MMA, but with fewer rules and more permanent injuries. The only things you weren't allowed to do were eye gouging and biting. Everything else, breaking fingers, choking, kicking, was fair game. And remember, they were doing this while covered in oil. It was less of a sport and more of a test to see who could survive the afternoon without a trip to the local healer. As the sun began to set, the gym would transform into a lounge. After the scraping and the sludge collection, the men would gather in the baths. This wasn't a quick rinse, it was a communal experience. You'd sit around in steam rooms or cold plunges, discussing who won the day's sprint and which politician was currently losing his mind. It was the ultimate boys' club, a place where the social hierarchy was reinforced through physical prowess and the ability to quote poetry while dripping wet. So, the next time you re-annoyed that the gym is too crowded or someone didn't wipe down the bench, just take a deep breath. At least you aren't being scraped with a metal hook by a stranger. You aren't being sold as a topical ointment. And you definitely don't have to debate the meaning of the infinite while someone tries to snap your collarbone in a sentence. The Greek gym was a place of high ideals and very, very high levels of body oil. Moving from the glistening, oil-slicked chaos of the gymnasium to the home might sound like a relief. But in ancient Greece, the comfort of your own home was more like a last-ache's domestic prison. In the modern world, your home is your sanctuary. It's where you kick off your shoes, order pizza, and ignore the rest of the world while you binge-watch something mindless. But if you were living in an ancient Greek, oikos, the household, your home was unto place to relax. To relax it was a highly regulated social unit where every room had a gender, and your primary job was to make sure the family bloodline did unaccidentally implode. First, let's talk about the architecture of stay over there. If you were a woman in a respectable Athenian household, you didn't just wander around the house like you owned the place, even if you technically did. Homes were strictly divided into the andron, the men's quarters we saw during the symposium, and the gynekon, the women's quarters. The gynekon was usually located on the upper floor or the furthest, most inconvenient corner of the house. It wasn't just a bedroom, it was a fortress. The idea was to keep the women of the house away from the eyes of any visiting men. If a male guest came over for dinner, the women disappeared like they were part of a witness protection program. Now, let's talk about the dating scene, which is a generous term for what was essentially a business merger involving a teenager and a man twice her age. In today's world, we complain about ghosting or bad Tinder bios. In ancient Greece, dating consisted of your father having a very intense conversation with another man over some diluted wine and deciding that yes, you would be a great addition to his estate. The bride was usually around 14 or 15, while the groom was often in his 30s. Imagine being a high school freshman and being told you moving in with a 35-year-old guy who spends all day at the gym talking about the truth. It wasn't a romance, it was a transfer of property. The wedding itself was less fairy tale and more legal kidnapping. The groom would literally drive a chariot to the bride's house, pick her up, and drive her to his home in a torchlit procession while people threw nuts and dried fruit at them. This wasn't a fun tradition. It was a symbolic, you live here now ceremony. Once she crossed the threshold, the bride ceased to be part of her father's family and became the property of her husband's oikos. Her job description was simple: produce a male heir and don't let the wool get dusty. If you think your to-do list is stressful, the Greek housewife's daily grind was a marathon of textile production. A respectable woman spent her life at the loom. If a man walked into a house and didn't hear the constant clack-clack-clack of weaving, he'd probably assume the family was spiraling into moral decay. Weaving wasn't a hobby, it was how the family got clothes. Everything from the tunics to the bedsheets had to be made by hand. It was the original slow fashion, but with 100% more social pressure and 0 Instagram likes. And then there were the social rules for being outside, which for a woman were basically don't. A respectable woman was expected to stay indoors as much as possible. If she had to go out, say, for a religious festival, or to fetch water, if the family was poor, had to be veiled and accompanied by a servant. If a woman was seen walking alone in the street, the neighbors didn't think, oh, she's getting some fresh air. They thought, something has gone terribly wrong with that family's management. To be well known was the ultimate insult for a Greek woman. The goal was for no man outside your family to even know your name. For the men, the home was essentially a place to sleep and store your stuff while you spent the rest of your life at the agora, the market, or the gymnasium. A man's social status was tied to how well he managed his oikos, but he didn't actually want to be in it. Being a homebody in ancient Greece wasn't a personality trait. It was a sign that you were probably a bit weird or lacked the masculine drive to go argue about taxes in public. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Slavery was the backbone of the Greek household, meaning there were always people around who were technically part of the family but had zero rights. Your private conversations were heard by servants. Your private moments were witnessed by the family's livestock, and your private business was basically the neighborhood's morning news. Finally, let's talk about the head of the house, the Kyrios. This guy had absolute legal power. He decided who his daughters married. He could disown his sons if they were particularly annoying, and he was the only one who could represent the family in court. He was the CEO, the HR department, and the Supreme Court, all rolled into one bearded man in a toga. So, the next time you re-annoyed that your roommate left a dish in the sink, or your partner is hogging the remote, just remember, at least you are unconfined to a second-story room, weaving a cloak for a man twice your age who you met 3 days ago at a chariot-based kidnapping. The ancient Greek home was a place of order, spinning wheels, and a complete, intentional lack of fun. Since we've managed to survive the stifling silence of the household, it's time to head into the absolute sensory overload of the agora. If the house was a prison of boredom, the agora was a circus of ego, commerce, and people shouting about fish. In the modern world, if you need a loaf of bread and a new pair of shoes, you go to a supermarket or click a button on your phone while lying in bed. It's quiet, it's efficient, and you don't have to talk to a single soul if you don't want to. But in ancient Greece, going to the shops was a high-stakes performance art piece. The agora was the heart of the city, a sprawling open-air market that was equal parts shopping mall, political stage, and the world's most aggressive comment section. First, let's talk about the demographic. If you walked into the Athenian agora at 10 o'clock a.m., you would notice one thing immediately. It was a sea of beards. Unless you were a slave fetching water or a very specific type of street vendor, the agora was a men-only club. Respectable women wouldn't be caught dead here. If a woman of status showed up to browse the pottery aisle, it would be the equivalent of a modern celebrity walking into a dive bar at 3 o'clock a.m. Everyone would stare, and the tabloids or the local gossips at the barber shop would have a field day. Shopping wasn't just about buying things. It was about the hustle. There were no fixed prices, no clearance stickers, no buy one get one free promotions, unless you were prepared to argue for 45 minutes. Every single transaction was a verbal wrestling match. If you walked up to a fishmonger and just paid the first price he quoted, he wouldn't think you were a great customer. He'd think you were an idiot. He might even be offended that you didn't give him the chance to lie to your face about how fresh the sea bass was. The fishmongers, by the way, were the legendary villains of the agora. Ancient comic poets wrote about them the way we write about greedy tech billionaires. They were famous for being rude, overcharging, and using tricks to make their fish look better, like hitting a drum to startle the customers so they would notice the fish was actually 3 days old and starting to smell like a gym locker. There was even a law in some cities that fishmongers couldn't sit down while selling, because if they sat, they'd get too comfortable and scam people even more efficiently. Imagine a world where the guy at the deli counter has to stand on one leg just so he does have the leverage to overcharge you for ham. But the agora wasn't just for food. It was organized into circles or sections. You had the poultry section, the slave market, a grim reminder that Greek freedom was very selective, and the Syrian, which was the place for gambling. If you wanted to lose your life savings on a dice game or a cockfight, this was your spot. And because the Greeks loved a good social hierarchy, where you shopped said a lot about who you were. Buying high-end perfume, you're a dandy. Buying cheap saltfish, you're probably struggling. Buying a philosopher, well, you're just showing off. Around the edges of the market were the stowers, long shaded porches with columns. This is where the real business happened. This was the LinkedIn of the 4th century BC. If you were a lawyer, a politician, or a philosopher, you didn't have an office with a mahogany desk and a succulent. You had a spot under a stoa. You'd stand there, looking busy, waiting for someone to come by, so you could explain why your theory on the prime mover was superior to the guy 3 pillars down. This is also where the sycophants lived. In modern English, a sycophant is a but in ancient Greece, they were much worse. They were professional lawsuit bringers. Athens was a notoriously litigious society. People sued each other for fun, for profit, and for spite. If you were walking through the agora and looked at someone the wrong way, a sycophant might pop out from behind a statue and inform you that you were being sued for impiety or damaging the public vibe. It was like living in a world where everyone is an unlicensed process server looking for a payday. And then there was the gossip. The Greeks had a specific word for the people who hung around the barber shops and perfume stalls just to trade rumors. Peripedikoi. They were the human version of a trending sidebar. If a general was having an affair, if a senator was secretly in debt, or if someone's goat had given birth to a 2-headed kid, the agora knew within 20 minutes. Privacy was a foreign concept. If you whispered something in the agora, you might as well have shouted it from the top of the Parthenon. The noise must have been incredible. You had blacksmiths hammering, vendors screaming about the price of onions, philosophers shouting about the allegory of the cave, and the constant clatter of wooden coins. The Greeks didn't use paper money. They used obols and drachmas, heavy silver or bronze coins that people often carried inside their mouths because tunics didn't have pockets. Yes, you read that right. If you wanted to buy a cabbage, you'd spit the payment into the vendor's hand. It gives a whole new meaning to dirty money and explains why the Greeks were so obsessed with hygiene everywhere else their currency was a biological hazard. By noon, the high market was over. The heat would become unbearable. The fish would start to turn, and the crowds would thin out. The men would head back to their gyms or their symposia, leaving the agora to the scavengers and the cleanup crews. So, the next time you're annoyed that the self-checkout machine is unexpectedly calling for assistance, just remember, at least you didn't have to carry your credit card under your tongue. You didn't have to engage in a 30-minute debate about the ethics of sea bass. And nobody tried to sue you for vibe theft on your way to the exit. The agora was the birthplace of democracy, but it was also the birthplace of the world's most stressful shopping experience. Since we've managed to survive the aggressive sales tactics and mouth-stored currency of the marketplace, it's time to face the ultimate Greek boss fight, the legal system. In ancient Greece, justice wasn't a blindfolded lady with a scale. It was 500 angry guys with a grudge and a handful of voting discs. In the modern world, if you get sued or accused of a crime, you hire a lawyer, a person who has spent 7 years studying tiny Latin words so they can argue on your behalf while you sit quietly and try to look innocent. But in ancient Athens, having a lawyer was actually illegal. You had to represent yourself. Imagine standing in front of a crowd of hundreds, facing a charge of impiety, or stealing a neighbor's prize olive tree, and your only defense is your own ability to keep a crowd entertained. It wasn't a trial. It was a televised talent show where the prize was not being executed. First, let's talk about the jury. In a modern court, you have 12 people who are usually trying their best to stay awake. In Athens, the standard jury size was 501 people, because there were no professional judges to tell the jury what the law actually meant. The trial was 100% a popularity contest. The goal wasn't necessarily to prove you were innocent. The goal was to make the jury like you more than the other guy. This led to some of the most shameless tactics in human history. It was perfectly standard to bring your crying children, your aging mother, and your war-wounded cousin into court to stand behind you and sob while you gave your speech. You weren't presenting evidence. You were weaponizing pity. Now, let's talk about the stopwatch of doom, the clepsydrew. This was a water clock used to time your speech. It was a large jar with a small hole at the bottom. When the plug was pulled, the water started draining into another jar. When the water ran out, your time was up. You had to be a master of pacing. If you spent too long complaining about the prosecution's haircut and ran out of water before you got to the part where you explain why you did untactually burn down the temple, that was it. You were done. The only time they stopped the clock was for the reading of evidence or witness testimony, which usually just involved someone shouting, "Yeah, I saw him do it," from the back. Speaking of evidence, if you wanted to use testimony from a slave, the law had a truly horrific rule. It was only considered valid if it was obtained under torture. The Greeks genuinely believed that a slave wouldn't tell the truth unless they were in pain. It's a massive, dark stain on their civilized reputation that highlights just how brutal the social hierarchy really was. If you were a slave, caught in the middle of a legal battle between two citizens, your Tuesday was about to get very, very bad. The voting process was equally intense. Each juror was given to bronze discs, one with a solid axle for not guilty, and one with a hollow axle for guilty. After the speeches were over, the jurors would walk up to two urns and drop their votes. To keep it secret, they held the disc by the axle between their thumb and finger, so no one could see if the center was solid or hollow. If you lost the vote, you didn't necessarily go straight to jail. In many cases, the penalty phase was its own separate drama. In the penalty phase, the prosecutor would propose a punishment like death or a massive fine, and then the defendant who would propose a counterpunishment. The jury then had to pick one of the two. You could unsuggest something ridiculous, like "I pay 1 drachma, and we all go for souvlaki," because the jury would just pick the prosecutor's death sentence out of spite. You had to be reasonable. When Socrates was on trial, he famously suggested that instead of being executed, the city should give him free meals for life for being so wise. The jury, unsurprisingly, found this vibe unhelpful and voted for the hemlock. There was also the practice of ostracism. Once a year, the citizens could vote to kick one person out of the city for 10 years. They didn't even need a reason. You didn't have to commit a crime. You just had to be annoying or too powerful. People wrote the name of the person they wanted to banish on a piece of broken pottery called an ostrakon. If you got enough votes, you had 10 days to pack your tunics and get out. It was the original cancel culture, but with actual physical relocation. So, the next time you get a jury duty summons in the mail and groan about the inconvenience, just be thankful. At least you aren't standing in front of 500 paid-to-be grumpy seniors, desperately trying to time your life story to a leaking jar of water while your kids cry on cue in the background. The Greek legal system was a chaotic blend of theater, mob rule, and very high-stakes public speaking. It's time to step into the world of the divine. In ancient Greece, faith wasn't a private Sunday morning thing. It was a high-stakes 24/7 negotiation with a group of gods who were basically a cosmic version of a dysfunctional reality TV cast. In the modern world, if you have a big decision to make, like whether to move to a new city or start a business, you look at data, check your bank account, and maybe talk to a mentor. In ancient Greece, you didn't check your bank account. You checked the liver of a sheep. You didn't consult a mentor. You asked a woman in a basement who was inhaling volcanic fumes until she spoke in riddles. Welcome to Greek religion, where the gods were everywhere, and they were incredibly petty. First, let's talk about the contract nature of Greek prayer. Today, many people pray for peace, guidance, or strength. The Greeks, however, treated prayer like a business transaction. It was less, please make me a better person, and more, hey, Poseidon, I gave you that really expensive bull last Tuesday, so if you could not sink my boat tomorrow, we'll call it even. It was a system called do you te, I give, so that you might give. If something went wrong in your life, you didn't think, that's just bad luck. You thought, which god did I forget to tip? Ritual was everything. If you messed up a single word in a prayer, or if the priest tripped over his robe while walking to the altar, the whole thing was void. You had to start over. It was like trying to fill out a government form where, if you use the wrong color pen, they seize your house, and the sacrifices. They were the ultimate social flex. If you were rich, you sacrificed a hecatomb, 100 oxen. If you were poor, you sacrificed a little cake shaped like an ox. The gods apparently appreciated the effort, or at least the baker did. But the real chaos started with omens. The Greeks believed that the gods were constantly texting us through the natural world, but they were using emojis that nobody quite understood. A sudden sneeze, that's a sign. An eagle flying to the right, great news. An eagle flying to the left, cancel all your plans and hide under the bed. This became especially insane during wartime. Before a battle, a general wouldn't just look at the enemy's formation. He'd call for the Sphagia quick sacrifice to check the entrails. If the liver looked off, if it was discolored, or missing a lob, the general would literally refuse to fight. Imagine being a soldier, fully armored, sweating in the sun, ready to charge, and your boss says, actually, guys, the sheep's gallbladder looks a bit suspicious. Let's head home and try again in a month. This happened all the time. There are historical accounts of armies sitting and watching each other for days because neither side could get a thumbs up from a goat's digestive tract. Then there were the oracles. If you wanted the premium high-definition version of God's will, you went to Delphi. This was the headquarters of the Pythia, a priestess who sat on a tripod over a crack in the earth. Modern scientists think she was likely inhaling ethylene gas from a geological fault line, which explains why her prophecies sounded like a word salad tossed by a blender. The genius of the oracles was their ambiguity. They were the masters of the vague post. When King Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle told him, if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. He thought, awesome, I'm going to win. He crossed the river, got annihilated, and realized too late that the great empire that fell was his own. The oracle was never wrong. You were just bad at reading the fine print. And let's not forget the superstition rules for daily life. The Greeks were terrified of miasma, kind of spiritual pollution. If you committed a crime, touched a dead body, or even just had a really bad run of luck, you were polluted. You couldn't enter a temple, and people might avoid sitting next to you at the theater. To get rid of it, you needed a purification, which usually involved being sprinkled with pig's blood. Imagine walking into a modern dry cleaner and asking for the sinner's special, involving a bucket of livestock fluids. Even your dreams were under surveillance. If you dreamt of a snake, you might be getting a promotion. If you dreamt of a forest fire, you should probably see a doctor. There were professional dream interpreters who charged a fee to tell you that your subconscious was actually a divine warning about your olive harvest. The most stressful part: the gods were anthropomorphic, which is a fancy way of saying they had the personalities of spoiled toddlers with nuclear weapons. They got jealous, they cheated on their spouses, and they held grudges for centuries. You weren't just following a religion, you were navigating a minefield of divine egos. If you accidentally bragged that your daughter was prettier than Hera, your daughter was probably going to end up as a spider or a very sad rock. So, the next time you feel unlucky because you hit a red light, just be glad. You don't have to cut open a chicken to decide if you should go to work. You don't have to travel 3 days to a cave to hear a gas-induced riddle about your future, and nobody is going to turn you into a laurel tree because you didn't like their poetry. Ancient Greek religion was a 24-hour job of keeping the universe from getting annoyed at you. Since we've finished negotiating with the moody gods and checking the spiritual vibe of sheep livers, it's time to talk about the kids. If you think modern school is stressful because of standardized testing or the threat of a no phones in class policy, you clearly wouldn't have survived a Tuesday in an Athenian schoolroom. In the modern world, education is about finding your passion, learning, and occasionally falling asleep during a PowerPoint presentation on the water cycle. In ancient Greece, education specifically for boys in cities like Athens was designed to turn you into a kalos kagathos, which is a fancy way of saying a beautiful and good citizen. In practice, this meant you spent your entire childhood doing 3 things: memorizing epic poetry until your brain melted, playing the lyre until your fingers bled, and wrestling until you could no longer feel your face. First, let's talk about the pedagogos. In today's world, a pedagogue is just a fancy word for a teacher. In ancient Greece, the pedagogos was a slave whose entire job was to be your shadow and your worst nightmare. He didn't teach you math. He followed you to school, carrying your books, made sure you didn't talk to strangers, and most importantly, had full legal permission to hit you with a stick if you slumped your shoulders or laughed too loudly. Imagine having a personal bodyguard who is also a professional snitch and is authorized to use corporal punishment if your posture is unaristocratic enough. Schooling was divided into 3 main branches: grammata, reading and writing; music, and poetry; and gymnastic, physical training. There was no history class because, to the Greeks, history was just stuff that happened to your grandfather. There was no science lab. Instead, there was Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey weren't just books. They were the entire curriculum. You didn't just read them, you memorized them, all 27,000 plus lines. If you could recite the exact catalog of Greek ships or the specific way Achilles pouted in his tent, you were considered a lost cause. It was the original core memory exercise. If you've ever struggled to remember a 4-digit PIN, imagine being 10 years old and having to perform a 2-hour oral exam on the Trojan War while a man with a switch stands over you waiting for a slip-up. Then came the music. To the Greeks, if you couldn't play the lyre, you were essentially uneducated. Music wasn't an elective. It was a moral requirement. They believed that certain musical scales could literally fix your personality. Feeling aggressive, play some Dorian mode. Feeling lazy, switch to the Lydian. If you were bad at the lyre, people did unthink you were unmusical. They thought you were a potential criminal with a disorganized soul. And let's not forget the aloes. This was a double-piped reed instrument that looked like 2 oboes stuck in your mouth at once. It was incredibly popular, but there was a catch. It made your face look ridiculous. Legend has it that the goddess Athena invented the pipes but threw them away because she saw her reflection in a stream and realized her cheeks looked like a bloated frog while playing. This created a massive social dilemma for Greek teenagers. Do you play the pipes and get the cool points, or do you avoid them so you don't ruin your statuesque aesthetic? Once you hit puberty, the fun part began. The gymnasium. We've already talked about the naked, oily wrestling, but for a student, this was where character building happened. The Greeks believed that a weak body led to a weak mind. If you couldn't run a sprint or throw a javelin, how could you be trusted to vote on a trade embargo? Education was a full-body experience. You studied philosophy in the morning and took an elbow to the ribs in the afternoon. It was like going to Harvard, but the final exam involved a cage match. In Sparta, education, the agoj, was a whole different level of trauma. At age 7, boys were taken from their mothers and put into herds. They weren't taught poetry. They were taught how to survive being punched. They were given 1 cloak a year, no shoes, and were intentionally underfed so they'd be forced to steal food. If they got caught stealing, they weren't punished for the theft. They were punished for being bad at stealing. It was essentially survival of the fittest. The middle school years, for girls, education was a much shorter list. Unless you lived in Sparta, where girls were encouraged to exercise so they'd produce stronger babies, your education happened at home. You learned how to manage a household, how to spin wool, and how to remain invisible. If a girl learned to read, it was usually a DIY project or something her mother taught her in secret. The goal wasn't to make her a thinker. It was to make her a silent partner in the domestic business. By the time a young man reached 18, he graduated to a Phoebe status. He spent 2 years in military training, finally putting all that wrestling and spear throwing to use. Only then, after a decade of sticks, lyres, and sand-filled ears, was he considered a man. So, the next time you re-complaining about a math test or the fact that your school cafeteria ran out of pizza, just remember, at least you don't have a slave following you around with a hitting stick. You don't have to memorize a 500-page poem about a wooden horse, and nobody is judging the vibrations of your soul based on how you play the flute. Ancient Greek education was less about learning and more about not being the weak link in the city-state. Since we've survived the physical and mental trauma of the Greek school system, you're probably hungry. But before you go looking for a gyro or a nice piece of baklava, I have some bad news. Neither of those exists yet. In ancient Greece, dinner was less about culinary delight and more about social survival and trying not to choke on a piece of barley. In the modern world, food is an experience. We have brunch, we have foodies, And we have people who will take 16 photos of a pancake before they eat it. In ancient Greece, if you spent too much time talking about how good your food tasted, people would look at you like you were a degenerate. To the Greeks, being a gourmet was a character flaw. It meant you were slave to your stomach. And if you can't control your appetite for sausages, how can we trust you to lead an infantry phalanx? Let's start with the basics. The Greek diet was built on the Mediterranean triad: grain, oil, and wine. If you didn't like those three things, you were essentially choosing a lifestyle of starvation. Breakfast was usually just a piece of barley bread dipped in wine. That's it. No eggs, no bacon, no avocado toast. Just soggy, alcoholic bread to kickstart your morning. It's the breakfast of champions. If those champions have a very high tolerance for morning heartburn and a very low bar for flavor. Lunch was basically breakfast. Part 2. Maybe you'd add an olive or a piece of cheese that was so hard it could be used as a weapon in a street fight. Meat was a rare luxury, usually only eaten after a religious sacrifice. In the Greek mind, you didn't just go to a butcher. You waited for the city to kill a bull for Zeus, and then you got a small, gristly piece of the leftovers. But if you want to talk about truly legendary bad food, we have to talk about the Spartan black broth mélèze, zomos. This was the staple meal of the Spartan military mess halls. It was made by boiling pig's legs, blood, salt, and vinegar. That's it. No herbs, no spices, no flavor profile. It was a thick, dark sludge that looked like a nightmare and apparently tasted worse. There's a famous story of a visitor from Italy who tried the black broth and said, "Now I know why the Spartans are so brave. Any man who has to eat this would rather die in battle than live another day." It wasn't a meal. It was a reason to seek out the enemy's spears. In Athens, things were slightly more civilized, but the social rules of dining were still a minefield. Most meals were eaten in gender-segregated groups. Men ate with men, and women ate in the back of the house, probably whispering about how the men were making a mess again. If you were a man invited to a dinner party, dipnon, you didn't just show up and start eating. You had to follow the dining etiquette of the elite. First, you had to wash your feet. This wasn't a suggestion. Since you were going to be reclining on a couch, recline with your feet near someone else's head. Stinky foot energy was the quickest way to get blacklisted from the next gathering. Once you were settled, there were no forks. The Greeks looked at the idea of a fork the way we look at someone trying to eat soup with a knitting needle, necessary and weird. You used your fingers. If you were eating something messy, like a lentil stew, you used a piece of hollowed-out bread as a spoon. When you were done, you didn't use a napkin. You wiped your hands on a piece of extra bread and threw it to the dogs. The floor of a Greek dining room was essentially a biological hazard zone of bread napkins and olive pits. Then there was the parasite. This wasn't a medical condition. It was a social role. A parasitos was a guy who was invited to dinner specifically because he was funny, a good storyteller, or a world-class flatterer. He got a free meal in exchange for being the human version of a suggested video feed. If he stopped being entertaining, he stopped eating. It was the original gig economy, but your paycheck was a bowl of figs and a slightly burnt piece of goat meat. Dessert was called second tables. This wasn't cake or ice cream. It was nuts, dried fruits, and maybe some cheese drizzled with honey. The Greeks loved honey. It was their only sweetener. They didn't have sugar, which meant their dental health was surprisingly better than ours, but their lives were 100% less sweet. And we can't talk about Greek dining without talking about the kylix. This was a shallow wine cup with handles. The trick was that as you drank, a picture would be revealed at the bottom of the cup. Usually, it was something funny or adult in nature, designed to make you laugh just as you were finishing your wine. It was a 5th century BC jump scare. Finally, let's talk about the wine again. As we mentioned in the symposium section, drinking it neat was for losers and barbarians. But the Greeks also had a weird habit of adding things to their wine that would make a modern sommelier weep. They'd add honey, herbs, and sometimes even seawater or lead. Yes, they thought it made the wine taste sweeter and helped it last longer. It also caused brain damage and reproductive issues. But hey, the notes of plum and heavy metal were really popping that season. So, the next time you re-looking at a menu and you re-annoyed that the restaurant doesn't have gluten-free options or the service is a little slow, just be glad you aren't eating a bowl of blood vinegar sludge. You aren't using a piece of bread to wipe the sweat off your hands. And nobody is expecting you to tell 500 jokes just to earn a handful of walnuts. Ancient Greek dining was a test of your stomach, your social standing, and your ability to tolerate lead-flavored water. Since we've survived the culinary gauntlet of blood broth and lead-flavored wine, it's time to talk about how you looked while doing it. If you think the clean girl aesthetic or the old money look is high maintenance, wait until you see the social requirements for ancient Greek beauty. In the Greek world, your outfit wasn't just clothing. It was a political statement, a status symbol, and occasionally a serious health hazard. In the modern world, fashion changes every 15 minutes. One day, we're wearing oversized hoodies. The next day, we're into quiet luxury. But the Greeks were the original masters of the capsule wardrobe. For about 1,000 years, their look consisted of variations of a single rectangular piece of fabric. They didn't have buttons, they didn't have zippers, and they certainly didn't have pockets. If you wanted to carry your keys or your heavy silver mouth coins, you were out of luck. Let's start with the chiton and the peplus. These were essentially fancy bed sheets held together by pins called fibulae. If you were a woman, you wore a peplusa, heavy wool garment that you draped over yourself like a very stylish toga blanket. If you were a man or a woman feeling lightweight, you wore a chiton made of linen. But here's the social rule: the fit was everything. You didn't just throw it on, you had to drape it perfectly. The way your fabric folded was how people judged your intelligence. If your hemline was uneven, the neighbors assumed you were a mess who couldn't be trusted with a vote. It was a world where a wrinkled tunic was essentially a public confession that your life was falling apart. Now, let's talk about the no tanning rule. In the modern world, people spend a fortune on bronzer and beach vacations to look sun-kissed. In ancient Greece, a tan was the ultimate social fail for a woman. If you were tan, it meant you were poor. It meant you had to work outside in the fields like a commoner. A respectable woman wanted to look like a piece of unbaked dough. The whiter the skin, the higher the status. To achieve this ghostly chic look, Greek women used white lead makeup. Yes, they rubbed a toxic heavy metal all over their faces to look pale. It made their skin look luminous for a week, and then it started eating their skin and making their hair fall out. But hey, beauty is pain, and in this case, beauty was also slow motion organ failure. They'd pair this with red lipstick made from crushed beetles or cinnabar, which is mercury just, to keep the poison theme going. But the weirdest beauty standard, the unibrow. Today, we spend a lot of time and money plucking, waxing, and threading to make sure our eyebrows are two distinct islands. The Greeks thought that was weird. To them, a continuous brow was a sign of intelligence and high-class beauty. If you weren't naturally blessed with a furry bridge between your eyes, you didn't panic. You just took some black soot or some ground-up goat hair and stuck it on your face with tree resin. Imagine going on a date and your eyebrow accidentally falls into your wine because the glue melted. That was the height of Athenian romance. For the men, the focus was all on the beard, until Alexander the Great came along and made everyone shave so their enemies could ungrab them by the chin during a fight. The beard was the ultimate sign of adulting. A man without a beard was either a boy or a slave. The Greeks took beard care incredibly seriously. They'd oil them, curl them, and scent them. If you wanted to insult a man, you didn't insult his mother. You pulled his beard. That was a meet me at the agora for a lawsuit level of disrespect. Then there was the hair. Everyone had long hair, and everyone spent a bizarre amount of time styling it. Men would tie their hair in elaborate buns or braids. If you were an athlete, you might cut it short. But for the average citizen, a good hair day involved a lot of olive oil and a gold headband. In Sparta, the warriors spent the morning of a battle combing their long hair. When a Persian spy saw them doing this before the Battle of Thermopylae, he thought they were being vain. He didn't realize that for a Spartan, looking your best was the first step toward killing everyone in the room. And finally, let's talk about the shoes, or rather, the lack of them. Sandals were common, but if you were at home, or at the gym, or just feeling hardcore, you went barefoot. Philosophers like Socrates were famous for never wearing shoes, even in the winter. It was a flex to show that your mind was so focused on the heavens that you did uncare about the sharp rocks on the ground. So, the next time you re-stressed about your skincare routine, or the fact that your jeans are out of style, just be glad you don't have to glue goat hair to your forehead to look smart. You aren't rubbing lead on your cheeks to look expensive. And nobody is judging your moral character based on how many folds are in your bedsheet tunic. Ancient Greek fashion was a high-stakes game of don't look like a farmer, and the rules were written in toxic makeup and olive oil. Since we've managed to get our lead-based makeup on and our goat hair unibrow is securely glued, it's time for some culture. But in ancient Greece, going to the theater wasn't a 2-hour evening out with popcorn and an intermission. It was a massive, mandatory, sunrise to sunset marathon of emotional devastation and political satire. In the modern world, if you don't like a movie, you can just leave. In ancient Greece, the theater was a civic duty. It was essentially democracy. If you were a citizen of Athens, the government actually paid for your ticket if you were too poor to afford one. Why? Because they believed that if you did, you'd tend to sit through 3 tragedies about a guy accidentally marrying his mom. You wouldn't be a functioning member of society. First, let's talk about the schedule. This wasn't a Friday night show. This was a 3-day festival called the City Dionysia. You'd wake up before dawn, grab a cushion because stone seats are a nightmare for your lower back, and prepare to sit there all day. You'd watch 3 tragedies in a row, followed by a satyr play, which was basically a lowbrow comedy involving people dressed as half-goats, and then a full-blown comedy. It was 12 hours of the world is ending, followed by 1 hour of look at this guy. Ass ridiculous fake beard. The stage was a marvel of low-tech engineering. They had no LED screens or surround sound, but the acoustics were so perfect that if someone dropped a coin in the center of the stage, you could hear it in the back row. They also had special effects. they used a mechana giant wooden crane to lower actors playing gods from the sky. This is where the term deus ex machina comes from. If a playwright got himself into a plot hole he couldn't fix, he'd just have a guy on a crane swing in and say, "I'm Zeus, everyone stop crying, the play is over." Now, let's talk about the actors. Here's a social rule that won't surprise you by now. It was strictly no girls allowed. All the parts, including the weeping mothers and the vengeful goddesses, were played by men. To make this work, they wore massive masks. These masks weren't just for disguise. They acted like a megaphone, helping project the actor's voice to the 14,000 people in the stands. They had giant, exaggerated expressions, one for extreme sadness and one for "I'm about to commit a crime." If you were in the back row, you couldn't see the actor's face, but you could definitely see the 6-foot-tall, frowning mask he was wearing. But the audience wasn't just sitting there quietly. A Greek audience was more like a modern football crowd. If they liked to play, they cheered and stomped. If they hated it, they didn't just write a bad review on Yelp, they threw things. We're talking olives, stones, and old bread. There are even stories of actors being chased off the stage by a mob because their performance was vibe deficient. And then there was the chorus. Imagine you're trying to have a private, dramatic conversation with your wife about your secret debt, and suddenly 15 guys in identical masks pop out from behind a pillar and start singing about how your family is cursed. That was the chorus. They were the moral compass of the play, representing the average Joe. They'd comment on everything. "Oh, look at him," they'd chant. "He's making a mistake. The gods are going to hate this. We told him so." They were essentially a live, singing Twitter feed that you couldn't block. Comedy was even more chaotic. While tragedies were about kings and gods, comedies were about real people. If you were a famous politician or philosopher in Athens, you weren't safe. Aristophanes, the king of comedy, once wrote a play called The Clouds, specifically to roast Socrates. He portrayed him as a guy who lived in a basket and talked to clouds. Socrates was actually in the audience that day. He supposedly stood up so everyone could compare his actual face to the ridiculous mask the actor was wearing. It was the original diss track, but performed in a marble stadium. The social pressure to attend was immense. The theater was where you learned how to feel catharsis, the purging of emotions. The Greeks believed that if you didn't cry your eyes out at a play, you'd carry that emotional sludge around and ruin the next town hall meeting. It was like mandatory therapy, but with more chanting and fewer comfortable chairs. And don't even get me started on the judges. At the end of the festival, 10 judges would pick a winner, but they didn't just vote. They picked names out of a jar to decide whose votes actually counted. Because the Greeks were so obsessed with random fairness that they even left their art awards to chance. So, the next time you re-annoyed because the person next to you in the cinema is chewing too loudly, just be thankful. At least you aren't sitting on a cold rock for 14 hours. Nobody is swinging a guy on a crane at your head to end the movie, and a chorus of 15 men is singing about your bad life choices while you retrying to eat your snacks. Ancient Greek theater was a beautiful, exhausting, and very loud civic requirement. Since we managed to purge our emotions at the theater and avoid getting pelted with olives, it's time to hit the road. But in ancient Greece, going on vacation wasn't a thing. You didn't just pack a carry-on and head to Mykonos for the vibes. Travel was a dangerous, sweaty, and spiritually high-stakes endeavor where your survival depended on a code of conduct called xenia in the modern world. Travel is all about the user experience. You check reviews on TripAdvisor. You book an Airbnb with a keypad entry so you don't have to talk to anyone. And if the pillows are too flat, you leave a scathing 1-star review. In ancient Greece, there were no reviews. The keypad entry was a heavy wooden bolt, and the host was someone who might legally be required to kill a sheep for you just because you knocked on his door. First, let's talk about the roads, or the lack thereof. Greece is essentially a collection of jagged mountains separated by goats. Unless you were traveling on one of the few sacred ways leading to a major temple, the road was usually just a dusty path, wide enough for one grumpy donkey. If you were wealthy, you might travel by horse or chariot, which was the ancient equivalent of driving a Ferrari on a hiking trail. Flashy, but your lower back would never forgive you. Most people just walked for days through territories where the local police were just a group of guys with spears who did recognize your face. This brings us to xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. The Greeks were terrified that a stranger knocking on their door might actually be a god in disguise, specifically Zeus, who loved a good undercover boss moment. Because of this, hospitality wasn't just being nice, it was a religious contract. The rules of xenia were very specific. If a stranger showed up at your house, you had to invite them in immediately, give them a bath, or at least some water for their dusty feet, feed them the best food you had. Crucially, you were unallowed to ask who they were or what they wanted until after they had finished eating. Imagine inviting a random guy off the street into your living room, letting him use your shower, making him a 3-course steak dinner, and then knowingly as he's wiping the crumbs off his shirt tasking, "So, are you a serial killer or just passing through?" If you broke these rules, you weren't just a bad host. You were an enemy of the gods. But the rule worked both ways. The guest had to be respectful and eventually offer a guest gift, usually a piece of pottery or a story from the road. It was the original couchsurfing, but with more potential for divine lightning strikes if you didn't leave a towel in the hamper. If you weren't lucky enough to find a private home, you had to stay at a pendecain. This was the ancient Greek version of a budget motel, and it was, to put it mildly, a disaster. These places were famous for being dirty, loud, and populated by people you wouldn't trust with a bronze coin. The beds were often just flea-ridden straw mats, and the room service was usually just a bowl of watered-down wine and a lecture from a host who was definitely trying to overcharge you. Most respectable people avoided these places like the plague. Staying in a pendecain was a sign that you had 0 friends and even fewer social connections. And then there was travel by sea. Since Greece is basically a giant coastline, the easiest way to get around was by boat. But easy is a relative term. Ancient Greek ships were triremes, long, narrow vessels powered by rows of exhausted men rowing in rhythm. If you were a passenger, you were basically sitting on a wooden plank in the sun, praying that Poseidon wasn't having a bad day. There was no lower deck with a buffet. You ate what you brought, you slept where you sat, and if a storm hit, you were essentially part of the ocean's new collection of sunken pottery. The Greeks also had a weird obsession with amulets for travel. You didn't leave home without a small bronze Hermes charm or a evil eye bead to protect you from the gaze of the envious. If you tripped over a rock, you didn't blame your sandals. You assumed someone had looked at your luggage with too much desire and cursed your journey. But the real social nightmare of travel was the passepartout, rather, the lack of one. In a world of city-states, you were only a citizen in your own town. As soon as you crossed the border into the next valley, you were a medic, a resident alien. You had no legal rights. If someone hit you with their chariot or stole your goat, you couldn't just call the police. You had to find a local proxenus, a citizen of that city who had agreed to act as a consul for people from your hometown. It was a giant, complicated web of who do you know. So, the next time you re-annoyed that your flight is delayed or your hotel room doesn't have a view of the pool, just remember, at least you don't have to worry that your Airbnb host is a shape-shifting deity testing your manners. You don't have to walk through a mountain pass guarded by bandits with names like the Cinnies. And you definitely don't have to carry a good luck bead just to make it to the next town without getting cursed by a goat. Ancient Greek travel was a test of your faith, your patience, and your ability to eat dinner with a complete stranger without asking their name. Since we survived the mountain bandits and the Flearden budget motels of the Greek countryside, you might find yourself feeling a bit under the weather. Maybe it's the lead in the wine, or maybe you tripped over a rock because your unibrow glue obscured your vision. Either way, you need a doctor. But in ancient Greece, healthcare was a wild mix of cutting-edge logic and let us see what this snake thinks about your symptoms. In the modern world, if you're sick, you go to a clinic, get a blood test, and receive a prescription for a pill backed by decades of clinical trials. In ancient Greece, medicine was a tug-of-war between the followers of Hippocrates, who thought your body was a series of plumbing issues, and the followers of Asclepius, who thought you just needed a really good nap in a room full of reptiles. First, let's talk about the four humors. This was the big theory of Greek medicine. They believed the human body was filled with four liquids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health wasn't about germs or viruses. It was about balance. If you had a fever, your doctor didn't think you had an infection. He thought you had too much blood. The solution: bloodletting. They would literally cut you open to let the extra out. It was the original quick fix, but with a high chance of you fainting before the bill arrived. If you weren't sanguine, too much blood, you might be melancholic, too much black bile. The Greeks used black bile to explain everything from depression to why someone was being annoying at a party. To fix these imbalances, doctors would prescribe purges. This usually involved drinking something that would make you violently ill from both ends until your humors were supposedly reset. It was like a detox juice cleanse. But instead of kale and ginger, it was hellebore, a plant that could actually kill you if the doctor was having an off day. But let's say the science route wasn't working. You'd head to an Asclepiana healing temple. This was essentially a medical spa where the treatment plan was incubation. You'd wash in a sacred spring, offer a clay model of your infected body part to the god, imagine a wall covered in tiny clay ears and toes, and then go to sleep in a long hall called the abbot. While you slept, the god Asclepius was supposed to visit you in a dream and perform surgery or tell you a joke that would cure your gout. And here's the fun part: the temple was filled with sacred snakes. These were non-venomous, but they were allowed to crawl over the sleeping patients. They believed that if a snake licked your wound, you were healed. If you woke up and found a 4-foot serpent staring at you, you weren't supposed to scream. You were supposed to say thank you, Lord Asclepius, and pay your bill on the way out. Now, let's talk about anatomy. The Greeks were world-class philosophers, but they were pretty squeamish about cutting open human bodies. It was a huge social taboo. So, their knowledge of what was happening inside you was mostly based on dissecting pigs and goats and assuming humans were basically the same but with better tunics. This led to some creative theories. For example, for a long time, many believed the brain was just a cooling system for the heart, which was where the real thinking happened. If you were smart, it meant your heart was hot, and your brain was doing its job of keeping you from overheating. Women's medicine was even weirder. They believed in the wandering womb. If a woman was feeling anxious or sick, Greek doctors often concluded that her uterus had literally detached itself and was wandering around her body like a lost tourist, bumping into other organs and causing trouble. To fix this, they used scent therapy. They would place bad-smelling things near the woman's nose and good-smelling things near her lower half to lure the womb back to its proper place. It sounds like a prank, but for an Athenian woman in 400 BC, this was top-tier medical intervention. Despite all the snakes and wandering organs, the Greeks actually made some huge leaps. They were the first to suggest that epilepsy was not a sacred curse from the gods, but a physical brain condition. They realized that diet, exercise, and sleep were the keys to not dying at 30. Hippocrates even came up with the Hippocratic Oath, which basically told doctors, hey, maybe try not to kill the patient on purpose. It was a low bar, but it was a start. So, the next time you re-annoyed by a long wait at the doctor's office or a needle poke for a flu shot, just be glad you don't have to sleep in a room full of sacred snakes. Nobody is trying to lure your organs around with scented oils, and your doctor is trying to balance your personality by draining a pint of your blood into a bronze bowl. Ancient Greek medicine was a 50-50 toss-up between a logic puzzle and a horror movie. Since we managed to balance our humors and survived being licked by a sacred temple snake, it's time to face the reality that every Greek man eventually had to deal with: the draft. In ancient Greece, being a citizen wasn't just about voting and eating olives. It was a subscription service to a very violent club. If you were a man between the ages of 18 and 60, you were a soldier, and war wasn't a remote thing happening on a screen. It was a loud, sweaty, 100-pound of bronze nightmare where your life depended on whether the guy to your left had a solid grip on his shield. In the modern world, we love the hero narrative. We like the lone soldier or the guy who saves the day with a daring solo mission. In ancient Greece, that guy was a liability. If you tried to be a hero in a Greek phalanx, you were basically opening a welcome sign for the enemy's spears. The phalanx was the ultimate social experiment in conformity, a dense block of men, 8 to 16 ranks deep, standing shoulder to shoulder until they became a single bristling wall of bronze. First, let's talk about the shield, the aspis. This wasn't just a piece of armor. It was a social contract. The shield was designed to protect your left side and the right side of the guy standing next to you. If you moved, he died. If he moved, you died. This is why the Greeks were so obsessed with cowardice. If you dropped your shield and ran, you weren't just saving yourself. You were literally dismantling the city's defense system. To lose your helmet or your breastplate was a misfortune. To lose your shield was a crime against the community. Then there was the gear. You were a hoplite, named after your gear, hopla. And here's the kicker: you had to pay for it yourself. If you were poor, you were a light skirmisher who threw rocks. If you had money, you were a human tank. You wore a bronze breastplate, bronze greaves on your shins, and the Corinthian helmet. The Corinthian helmet is the most iconic piece of Greek armor, but it was also a sensory deprivation chamber. It had no ear holes, and the eye slits were so narrow you had zero peripheral vision. You couldn't hear your commander, you couldn't see the guy 5 feet to your right, and you were breathing your own recycled garlic breath for 3 hours straight. The battle itself was less like a movie and more like a human car crash. It was called the athtismos, or the push. 2 phalanxes would walk toward each other slowly, because running in 60 pounds of bronze is a great way to trip and get trampled, and then they would literally just slam into each other. You weren't fencing or doing cool moves, you were leaning your shoulder against your shield and pushing with all your might while trying to jab an 8-foot spear into any gap in the enemy's armor, usually their neck or groin. It was a claustrophobic, terrifying wrestling match. The men in the back ranks weren't even fighting. They were just pushing the men in front of them to keep the momentum going. Imagine being in the middle of a mosh pit where everyone is wearing metal and trying to kill you with a stick. If the formation held, you won. If one guy's courage failed and he stepped back, the whole zip of the phalanx would unspool, and that's when the real slaughter began. But before the pushing started, there was the paean. This was a battle hymn. Imagine thousands of men all rhythmically chanting a song to Apollo as they marched toward a wall of spears. It was designed to keep the rhythm, steady the nerves, and honestly terrify the other side. If you've ever been at a sports stadium where the home crowd starts a deafening chant, you have a small idea of the psychological warfare. And then there was the trophy. After the battle, the winners didn't plant a flag. They built a tropaiana, wooden frame shaped like a person, draped in the armor. They stripped off the dead enemies. It was a scarecrow of victory. But here's the civilized social rule. Once the trophy was built, the battle was officially over. You weren't allowed to pursue the fleeing enemy and wipe them out. That was considered bad form. You'd won the point. You'd built your metal scarecrow, and now everyone could go home and argue about who was the bravest. In Sparta, the rules were even more intense. Spartans didn't have walls around their city. When asked why, they pointed to their soldiers and said, "These are Sparta's walls." They were trained to believe that retreating was a physical impossibility. A Spartan mother famously told her son as he went to war, "Come back with your shield, or on it," meaning either win or be carried back dead. Bringing back just yourself was not an option on the menu. So, the next time you re-annoyed about having to work in a collaborative team environment, or you feel like your office cubicle is too cramped, just be glad. Your teamwork does involve leaning your shoulder against a sweaty guy in a bronze vest while people try to poke your eyes out with a spear, and your boss doesn't expect you to come back on your shield if the quarterly report is late. Ancient Greek war was a brutal, intimate, and incredibly heavy social requirement. Since we've finished discussing the glory of the bronze-clad human tank, it's time to talk about the people who polished that bronze, cooked the meals, and made the whole Greek lifestyle possible while receiving zero credit and even less freedom. If you want to understand ancient Greek social rules, you have to understand that democracy was a luxury apartment built on a foundation of human property. In the modern world, we talk about work-life balance and outsourcing. In ancient Greece, if you were a citizen, your work-life balance was basically 100% life, because you outsourced 100% of the work to someone else. The Greeks believed that in order for a man to be a true citizen, to have the time to sit in the agora, vote in the assembly, and exercise at the gym. He couldn't be bothered with menial tasks like farming, cleaning, or making his own sandals. That was the job of a doulos, or slave. First, let's talk about the scale. This wasn't a small niche part of society. In Athens, it's estimated that there were roughly as many slaves as there were free citizens. If you walked down a street in 450 BC, every second person you saw was technically property. Slavery wasn't based on race, but on luck. If your city lost a war, you were a slave. If you were kidnapped by pirates, a very real career path back then, you were a slave. If you couldn't pay your debts, you might become a slave to your neighbor. It was a wrong place, wrong time lottery that could hit anyone. The social rules for slaves were a bizarre mix of invisible worker and domestic confidant. There were different tiers of misery. If you were an agricultural slave, your life was a grueling marathon of plowing fields under the Mediterranean sun. If you were a domestic slave, you lived in the oikos, slept on the floor, and knew every single secret your master had. You were the one who heard the private conversations, saw the private fights, and probably helped the master home when he was too drunk to walk after a symposium. You were part of the family in the same way a toaster is part of a kitchen useful present, but entirely replaceable. But then there were the silver mines of Lorien. This was the death sentence tier. If you were a slave sent to the mines, you weren't part of the family. You were a biological machine designed to crawl through narrow, suffocating tunnels in the dark to extract the silver that made Athens rich. The mortality rate was horrific, the air was toxic, and the social rules there were simple. Work until you stop breathing. When we look at the beautiful silver coins or the Parthenon, we re-looking at the literal blood and sweat of people who never got to see the sun. Now, let's talk about the Scythian archers. This is one of the weirdest social quirks of Athens. The police force of the city was made up of public slaves from Scythia, modern-day Ukraine, Russia. These were men owned by the city who wore pointed hats and carried bows. Their job was to keep order during the assembly. If the citizens were being too loud or refusing to vote, the Scythian archers would swing a rope dipped in red, wet paint. If you got red paint on your tunic, you were fined for being a bad citizen. Imagine a world where the police are slaves, and their only weapon is a shame rope that ruins your dry cleaning. Could you get out? Yes, through manumission. A slave could theoretically save up enough money if their master allowed them to keep tips to buy their freedom. Or, a master might free a slave in his will as a thank you for 30 years of not poisoning his soup. But even then, the social rules didn't let you go. You became a Medica resident alien. You were free, but you still couldn't vote. You still couldn't own land. And you still had to have a patron, usually your former master, who was legally responsible for you. You were essentially on permanent parole. The Greeks had a very specific way of justifying this. Aristotle, the father of logic, famously argued that some people were slaves by nature. He thought their brains were just wired differently, that they were great at following orders, but lacked the deliberative faculty to run their own lives. It's a convenient theory when you read the one who needs someone to carry your heavy shield to the gym. So, the next time you're feeling overworked, and you jokingly say you're a slave to the office, take a look at the ancient Greeks. Their golden age was powered by millions of people who had no names in history books, who lived in the corners of marble houses, and whose only social rule was to exist without being noticed. It's the dark, silent engine behind every statue and every philosophical truth we still quote today. Since we've seen the invisible workers who kept the city running, let's look at the other half of the population that was equally restricted, the women. In ancient Greece, if you were a woman of good standing, your relationship with the public world was a constant game of the floor is lava, except the lava was social scandal. In the modern world, women go to work, go to the gym, meet friends for coffee, and generally exist in public spaces without anyone thinking it's a sign of a moral collapse. But in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, a virtuous woman was essentially a ghost. Pericles, one of the most famous Athenian leaders, once said that the greatest glory for a woman was to be least talked about among men, whether for good or bad. Basically, if people knew you existed, you were doing it wrong. First, let's talk about the social barrier. If you were a respectable wife or daughter, the public world was not for you. You didn't go to the agora to browse for spices. You sent a slave. You didn't go to the political assembly to hear the speeches. You stayed home and heard a sanitized version from your husband later. If a man who wasn't a relative walked into your house, you were expected to scurry away to the gynekon like a startled house cat. The social rule was simple. Your name should never leave the four walls of your house. But women couldn't stay inside forever. There were two main exceptions to the stay inside rule: religious festivals and funerals. Religion was the one area where women had a public voice. During festivals like the Thesmophoria, women would leave the house for days at a time to perform rituals, camp out, and this is the best part, roast the men. It was a government-sanctioned girls' trip where men were strictly forbidden from entering. It was the only time a woman could walk through the city with her head held high, knowing that if a man interrupted the ritual, he'd face the wrath of the gods and probably a very angry crowd of women with ritual torches. Then there were the funerals. In ancient Greece, grief was a female-led performance art. When someone died, the women of the family were the ones who prepared the body, and they were the ones who led the guz, the ritual lamentation. This wasn't a quiet, dignified sniffle. This was a full-contact, emotional event. Women were expected to wail, tear their clothes, and scratch their cheeks until they bled. If you didn't look like you were having a complete mental breakdown, people thought you didn't love the deceased. In fact, the government eventually had to step in and pass sumptuary laws to tone it down. They literally had to pass a rule saying, "Okay, ladies, we appreciate the enthusiasm, but let us stop the self-mutilation and maybe limit the number of outfits you bury with the body." It's one of the few times in history where crying too loud was a legal issue. Now, let's talk about the veil. When a woman did have to go out to a festival or to visit a relative, she didn't just walk out in her kitten. She wore a credinon, a veil that covered her head and parts of her face. It wasn't just a fashion accessory, it was a portable wall. It signaled to the world, I am a respectable woman, do not look at me, and definitely do not talk to me. If a man spoke to a veiled woman in the street, he wasn't just being rude, he was committing a social assault on her family's honor. Of course, these rules only applied if you were rich. If you were poor, the stay-home rule was a luxury you couldn't afford. Poor women worked. They sold ribbons in the market, they worked as wet nurses, and they fetched water from the public fountains. This created a weird social divide. The elite women looked down on the working women because they were public, while the working women probably looked at the elite women and wondered how they survived being bored to death in an upstairs room for 20 years. And then there were the hetairai. These were the influencers of the ancient world. They weren't respectable wives, But they were educated, they paid taxes, and they were the only women allowed to attend the symposium. They could talk about philosophy, they could play instruments, and they had more freedom than any virtuous wife. It was a bizarre paradox. The more socially acceptable you were as a woman, the less freedom you actually had. So, the next time you're walking down the street, listening to a podcast and grabbing a coffee, just realize how radical that simple act is. In ancient Greece, your fresh air would have been a scandal. Your coffee run would have required a veil and a servant, and your name being mentioned by anyone outside your family would have been a tragedy. Ancient Greek public life for women was a silent, veiled, and very lonely tightrope walk. Since we've seen the invisible world of women and slaves, it's time to head back out into the sun for the most prestigious social event in the Greek calendar, the Olympics. But forget the modern version, with its lycra suits, professional commentators, and spirit of participation. The ancient Olympics were a naked, violent, and deeply religious spectacle, where second place was just the first person to be forgotten by history. In the modern world, the Olympics are a global festival of peace. We have the Olympic truce, we have silver and bronze medals, and we have athletes who are happy just to be there. In ancient Greece, if you didn't win, you were a loser. Literally, there was no silver medal. There was no bronze. You either got the olive wreath and became a living god, or you slunk home through the back alleys of your city so your neighbors would unsee your shame. First, let's talk about the atmosphere. The games took place in Olympia, which wasn't a city, it was a giant religious sanctuary. Every 4 years, a sacred truce was declared across the Greek world. Wars were paused, lawsuits were put on hold, and thousands of men, and only men, trekked across the mountains to a dusty, overcrowded field in the middle of nowhere. There were no hotels. You slept in a tent or on the ground, and the heat was so intense that people regularly fainted from dehydration. The smell. Imagine 40,000 men who haven't showered in a week, mixed with the blood and smoke of 100 sacrificed oxen. It wasn't a spa day. It was a test of endurance before the events even started. Now, let's talk about the dress code, or, as we saw in the gymnasium, the complete lack of one. Athletes competed in the buff. This started, according to legend, when a runner's loincloth fell off mid-race. He won anyway, and everyone decided that fabric was just holding them back. The only thing you wore was a thick coating of olive oil. If you were a spectator, you were also probably roasting in the sun, because the Greeks didn't believe in roofs for stadiums. The events themselves were designed to prove arete, the peak of human excellence. There was the stadion, a 200-meter sprint, the pentathlon discus, javelin, jump, running, and wrestling, and the chariot races. The chariot race was the Formula One of the ancient world. It was the only event where you could win without being an athlete. Why? Because the winner wasn't the driver, was the owner of the horses. If you were a wealthy billionaire who wanted an Olympic title, you just bought the best horses and hired a guy to risk his life driving them around a sharp turn at 40 miles per hour. It was the original pay-to-win mechanic. But the most popular event was the pankration. This was a no-holds-barred combat sport. As we mentioned before, you could do anything except bite or gouge eyes. Everything else, breaking bones, strangulation, kicking, was encouraged. There are stories of athletes who died during the match but were still declared the winner because their opponent gave up first. If you've ever felt like your workout was killing you, just be glad your trainer is untamed 200-pound Greek man trying to literally tie your legs in a knot. what was the prize. Today, an Olympic gold medal is made of silver and plated in gold, and it comes with a sponsorship deal for a cereal brand. In ancient Greece, you got a wreath, just some leaves. At Olympia, it was wild olive. At the Isthmian Games, it was dried celery. That's it, a salad on your head. But that salad was a ticket to a life of luxury. When you returned to your home city, they didn't just give you a parade. They often tore down a section of the city wall, because city with a champion doesn't need walls. You got free meals for life at the public's expense, the best seats at the theater, and poets would write songs about your divine muscles that people would still be reading 2,000 years later. You were an A-list celebrity, a religious icon, and a political powerhouse all rolled into one oiled-up package. There was one rule, however, that was strictly enforced. No women, not even as spectators. If a woman was caught at the Olympic Games, the penalty was being thrown off a nearby cliff. Legend says one mother, Calipatera, snuck in disguised as a trainer to watch her son compete. She got so excited when he won that she jumped over a fence. Her disguise fell off, and well, she was spared because her father, brothers, and son were all Olympic champions. But after that, the rules were changed so that trainers had to be naked too, just to be sure. So, the next time you re-watching the Olympics and you see an athlete crying because they only got the silver medal, tell them to toughen up. In ancient Greece, there were no consolation prizes, no clothing, and if you lost, you'd better have a very good plan for how to sneak back into your house under the cover of darkness. The Greek Olympics were about glory, blood, and the absolute refusal to be number two. Since we've finished watching the oiled-up human car crash that was the Olympics, it's time to dry off and use our brains. But be careful. In ancient Greece, thinking too hard could get you a massive paycheck or a cup of poison. There was no middle ground. If the gymnasium was for the body, the stoa was for the minda, place where truth was the prize, and your tongue was the only weapon allowed. In the modern world, if you want to learn about the meaning of life, you watch a YouTube video, listen to a podcast. In ancient Greece, philosophy was a full-contact street sport. It didn't happen in ivory towers. It happened in the dirt, under the shade of a porch, while people were shouting about the price of onions 10 feet away. First, let's talk about the sophists. These were the original influencers of the ancient world. They were traveling teachers who claimed they could teach you arete excellence for a very, very high fee. In a democracy like Athens, the most important skill wasn't knowing how to farm. It was knowing how to win an argument. If you could convince 501 grumpy jurors that your neighbor stole your goat, even if you never had a goat, you were powerful. The sophists were the masters of rhetoric. They didn't care if something was true. They cared if it was persuasive. They were the guys who would teach you how to argue both sides of an issue just for the flex. Imagine a lawyer who also runs a masterclass on how to gaslight your friends into thinking the sky is green. Plato and Socrates hated them. To the real philosophers, the sophists were just intellectual mercenaries who were selling the soul of the city for a handful of drachmas. Then there was Socrates. If the sophists were the polished, expensive consultants of the 5th century BC, Socrates was the guy who stayed in his pajamas all day and asked you uncomfortable questions until you started crying. He didn't charge a fee. He didn't even have a school. He just wandered around the agora, stopped people who looked like they knew what they were doing, and asked, "What is justice, or what is courage?" This is the Socratic method. It sounds noble, but in practice, it was incredibly annoying. Imagine you just trying to buy some salt fish, and a shoeless man with a weird nose stops you and proves, through a series of logical traps, that you actually have no idea what goodness is. You'd want to sue him, too. And eventually, the Athenians did. They charged him with corrupting the youth and not believing in the city's gods. His real crime, of course, was making the powerful people of Athens look like idiots in public. But philosophy wasn't just one thing. It was a collection of life hacks that were often mutually exclusive. You had to pick your team, the Stoics. They believed the world was going to burn anyway, so you might as well stay calm. Their social rule was, if you can't control it, don't worry about it. It was the original "it is what it is" philosophy. The Epicureans, often misunderstood as just party animals, they actually believed in avoiding pain. Their goal was ataraxia state of chill. To an Epicurean, a piece of plain bread and a good friend were better than a 10-course feast that might give you a stomachache later. The Cynics, these were the punks of philosophy. Diogenes the Cynic famously lived in a giant clay jar in the street, barked at people, and once told Alexander the Great to get out of my sunlight. Their social rule was, society is a lie, go back to nature. One of the weirdest social rules of philosophy was the school system. After Socrates died, his student Plato started the academy. It wasn't a building. It was a grove of trees. Aristotle then started the Lyceum. These weren't just places to learn. They were tiny, private think tank communities. If you were a Platonist, you didn't just study Plato's books, you adopted his entire vibe. It was like being in a very intense book club where the book was the secret of the universe. And we can't forget the paradoxes. The Greeks loved a good brain teaser. Zeno of Ilia famously argued that movement was impossible. He said that if you want to walk to a wall, you first have to walk halfway. Then you have to walk halfway again. Since you can always divide the distance in half, he argued, you can never actually reach the wall. It's the kind of stoner logic that drove the Greeks wild and made people want to throw a sandal at him just to prove that movement does, in fact, exist. So, the next time you're annoyed because someone on the internet is being pedantic or trying to win an argument on a technicality, just remember, you're participating in a 2,500-year-old Greek tradition. Whether you repaying a sophist for a career coaching seminar or you being Socratic by asking why, until your partner leaves the room. You walking in the footsteps of men who thought that a well-placed ergo was more powerful than a lightning bolt. It's now time to face the one social rule that even the most powerful senator could Socratic method his way out of: dying. In ancient Greece, death wasn't just the end of your life. It was the beginning of a very complicated, very expensive commute. In the modern world, death is handled with quiet dignity, medical certificates, and perhaps a polite service. In ancient Greece, death was a logistical nightmare. If your family didn't follow the social rules of the departed to the letter, you would unjust be dead. Be a homeless ghost wandering the banks of a swampy river for all eternity because you forgot your wallet. First, let's talk about the entry fee. When a Greek person died, the very first thing their relatives did was place a small silver coin under their tongue or over their eyes. This wasn't a gift for the deceased to spend in the afterlife on snacks. It was a literal toll for Charon, the ferryman of the dead. Charon was the original grumpy transit worker. If you showed up at the river Styx without your obol, he wouldn't let you on the boat. You'd be stuck on the shore as a shade, a shadow person forever. Imagine being stuck in the Corrival's hall of the world's worst airport for 1,000 years because you did, have $5 for the shuttle. Once you crossed the river, you had to deal with the security detail. This was Cerberus, the three-headed dog. He wasn't there to keep people out. He was there to keep people in. The Greeks believed that the underworld was a one-way street. To get past him without being eaten, you usually needed a honey cake that your relatives buried with you. It was essentially bribery by pastry. Now, let's talk about the neighborhoods. The Greek afterlife wasn't just a heaven or hell binary. It was a three-tiered zoning system based on your life's vibe. Tartarus, this was the basement. It was for the real villains, people who tried to trick the gods or were just generally terrible. This is where Sisyphus is stuck pushing a boulder up a hill forever, and Tantalus is standing in water he can't drink. It's the maximum security wing of the universe, the Asphodel Meadows. This is where 99% of people went. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't fun. It was gray. It was the waiting room of eternity. You basically wandered around in a field of bland flowers, slowly losing your memory and your personality until you were just a humming shadow. It was the ultimate participation trophy for living an average life. Elysium, the Elysian Fields. This was the VIP lounge, originally only for heroes and relatives of the gods. It eventually opened up to anyone who was exceptionally virtuous. It was basically a never-ending sunset beach party with music, sports, and zero taxes. The most important social rule for the living was the prothesis, the laying out of the body. As we saw with the women in public, this was a massive performance. If a family didn't mourn loudly enough, or if they forgot to pour libations, wine, and oil onto the grave, the ghost of the deceased could come back as a phasma to haunt them. The Greeks were terrified of unrestful spirits. If you were having bad luck, your first thought wasn't, "I need a better job." It was, "Did I give Grandpa enough honey cakes at the cemetery last month?" And then there was the river Lethe, before you could be reincarnated, a belief some Greeks held, or settle into your gray afterlife. You had to drink from this river. The water caused total amnesia. You forgot your wife, your kids, your favorite sandals, and that one time you won a wrestling match at the local gym. To the Greeks, the loss of memory was the true death. This is why they were so obsessed with fame. If people kept saying your name back in the world of the living, you were immortal in the only way that actually mattered. The social rule of the cemetery was also about status. If you were a big deal, you didn't just get a headstone. You got a stela, tall marble slab with a relief carving of you doing something cool, like holding a bird or looking thoughtful. These were placed along the main roads leading into the city. Entering Athens was like walking through a who's who of dead people. It was a constant reminder that you were part of a long chain of oiled-up, argument-loving, goat-sacrificing humans. So, the next time you're worried about your digital legacy or your retirement fund, just be glad. You don't have to worry about carrying a silver coin in your mouth to pay a supernatural boatman. You don't have to bake a cake for a three-headed dog. And your eternal happiness doesn't depend on your nieces and nephews crying loudly enough at your funeral to satisfy the neighbors. Ancient Greek death was the final, most stressful social obligation of all. We talked about public religion, the sacrifices, the temples, and the grumpy chickens. But for many Greeks, that wasn't enough. They wanted a VIP experience with the gods. Enter the mystery cults, specifically the Eleusinian mysteries. The social rule of a mystery cult was simple: talk about it, and we kill you. Literally, divulging the secrets of the mysteries was a capital offense. This is why, even today, historians have to piece together what happened from hints and leaks. Once a year, thousands of people walked from Athens to Eleusis in a massive procession. Unlike the Olympics or the Assembly, anyone could join, men, women, and even slaves, as long as you spoke Greek and hadn't committed a blood crime murder. After days of fasting and drinking a mysterious potion called kysion, which scientists suspect was made from ergotin-fested grain, essentially a prehistoric form of LSD, the initiates entered the telesterion. Inside, something sacred was shown. We don't know exactly what it was, but it likely involved a ritual reenactment of the myth of Demeter and Persephone. People walked out of that room claiming they were no longer afraid of death. They felt they had a fast pass to the Elysian fields. It was the ultimate exclusive membership that promised a better afterlife than the gray, boring meadows everyone else was stuck with. So while the rest of the city was arguing about taxes, the initiates were walking around with a secret smile, knowing that because they saw a specific ear of grain in a dark room while tripping on fungus, they were set for eternity. In the sunny, rational world of the Athenian agora, men argued about logic, geometry, and the prime mover. But when the sun went down and the logic failed, the Greeks turned to something much darker and more desperate: katadesmoi, or curse tablets. If you couldn't win a lawsuit through rhetoric, or if the girl you liked was interested in a guy with a better beard, you didn't just give up. You went to a professional root cutter or a sorcerer, bought a thin sheet of lead, and commissioned a hit on someone's soul. The social rule of Greek magic was that it was a hidden industry. Everyone used it, but nobody wanted to admit they needed it. Magic was the dark mirror of the legal system. While a court case was a public performance, a curse was a private, subterranean contract. The process was ritualistic and incredibly specific. You would take a small, rectangular piece of lead, chosen because lead is cold, heavy, and associated with the dead, and scratch your enemy's name into it. But you didn't just write, "I hate Philo." You wrote a binding spell that targeted specific parts of his body or his life. A typical curse might say, "I bind Philo, the fishmonger. I bind his tongue so he cannot speak in court. I bind his hands so he cannot count his coins. I bind his feet so he cannot walk to the assembly." The lead sheet would then be folded or pierced with a bronze nail to fix the curse in place. To make the spell actually work, you couldn't just throw it in the trash. You had to deliver it to the chthonic underworld gods. This meant dropping the tablet into a place that was physically close to the afterlife: a deep well, a fresh grave, or the site of a murder. The idea was that the restless dead, the ghosts of people who died young or violently, would find the tablet, read it, and act as your supernatural bounty hunters. You were essentially hiring a ghost to do the dirty work that the laws of the city would allow. This practice reveals a side of the Greek mind that isn't often taught in school. For all their talk of reason, the Greeks were terrified of the unseen. They believed that words had physical power. If you spoke a name with the right intention, you could physically alter that person's fate. This is why many people were protective of their names. To have your name written on a piece of lead in a graveyard was the ancient equivalent of having your identity stolen and your bank account drained simultaneously. It was a spiritual assassination. We have found thousands of these tablets across the Greek world. And they cover everything from high-stakes politics to petty neighborhood squabbles. There are judicial curses designed to make an opponent forget their speech in court, a very effective strategy in a system where you only had one shot at an oral defense. There are commercial curses where one tavern owner tries to bind the customers and profit of the tavern across the street. And, perhaps most common of all, there are erotic curses. These weren't love spells in the way we think of them today. They weren't meant to make someone fall in love with you. They were meant to compel them. A man might curse a woman so that she could not sleep, eat, or drink until she came to his door. It was aggressive, possessive, and entirely about control. The language was often violent, calling on the gods to burn her heart or sting her soul until she complied. It shows the darker, more coercive side of Greek social relations, where the lack of personal agency for women was mirrored in the magical attempts to enslave their wills. Beyond lead tablets, the Greeks used kolossoi, small dolls made of wax, clay, or lead. These weren't voodoo dolls for causing physical pain, but for binding. Often, these dolls would be found with their hands tied behind their backs, or their heads turned backward, buried in miniature lead coffins. The goal was to bind the target's ability to act against you. If you were a general worried about a rival's popularity, you might bury a bound doll to ensure he stayed tied up and could outshine you at the next assembly. Professional sorcerers, often called goats, were the ones who facilitated this. They lived on the fringes of society, often traveling from city to city with books of power filled with nonsensical words called voces magicae. These were long strings of vowels or foreign-sounding names that were believed to be the true names of the gods. By chanting eske, kadiske, iran, orin, or similar gibberish, the sorcerer claimed to bypass the gods' usual indifference and force them to listen. It was a hack for the divine system. The state's reaction to this was complicated. While harmful magic beneficium was technically illegal, it was incredibly hard to prove. How do you prove in court that your leg broke because your neighbor buried a piece of lead in a well? Because of this, magic flourished in the shadows of the Age of Reason. It was the safety valve for a society with high social pressure and limited legal recourse for many people. If the system failed you, the spirits of the dead were always open for business. The presence of these curses also tells us about the intense competitiveness of Greek life. Every aspect of life, from the courtroom to the bedroom to the marketplace, was a contest agony. In a world where there was only winner and loser, the temptation to use a supernatural cheat code was overwhelming. The Greeks weren't just rational, they were desperately, fiercely competitive, and if lead and ghosts could give them an edge, they were going to use them. So, the next time you think of ancient Greece as a place of white marble and calm philosophy, remember the dark wells filled with lead. Remember the people crouching in graveyards at midnight, nailing a name to a piece of metal. It reminds us that behind every great civilization is a subterranean layer of fear, envy, and the ancient human desire to get even by any means necessary. The Golden Age was built on marble, but it was haunted by lead. Since we've explored the dark, subterranean world of lead tablets and restless ghosts, it's time to climb back into the sunlight of the stadium. However, we aren't going back to the Olympics. While the naked wrestling and chariot crashes of Olympia get all the modern press, the ancient Greeks were far too competitive to limit their national championships to just one festival every 4 years. They had an entire circuit of high-stakes events known as the Pan-Hellenic Games. If the Olympics were the World Cup of the body, the Pythian Games were the Grammys of the soul, where your ability to hit a high note on a flute or recite a poem without stuttering was treated with the same life-or-death intensity as a spear-throwing contest. The Pythian Games, held at Delphi, were the second most important event in Greece. But unlike the Olympics, which focused almost entirely on physical grit, the Pythian Games began as a celebration of Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and light. The social rule here was that excellence, arete, wasn't just about how fast you could run. It was about the harmony of your mind and voice. In the early days, the only event was a singing competition where performers sang a hymn to Apollo, accompanied by the kithara, a heavy, professional-grade lyre. Imagine 15,000 Greeks sitting in a stone theater on the side of a mountain, listening to a man sing about a god slaying a giant snake. If he went flat, or if his lyrics were derivative, the crowd wouldn't just be disappointed, they would consider it a spiritual failure. As the games evolved, they added more musikoe agons, or musical contests. There were competitions for the aulos, the double reed pipe, and even a specific contest for aulos music without singing, which was essentially the ancient version of an instrumental prog rock solo. The most famous piece was the Pythian strain, a musical representation of Apollo's fight with the dragon Python. The performer had to use their pipes to mimic the god's challenge, the dragon's screams, and the final victory whistle. It was a technical nightmare that required the breath control of a deep-sea diver and the finger dexterity of a surgeon. But don't think for a second that these musical games were any less aggressive than the sports. The social pressure was immense. To the Greeks, music was a moral force. They believed that certain rhythms could literally rewire your brain to be more courageous or more disciplined. Therefore, a musician wasn't just an entertainer. He was a cultural engineer. If a performer used a subversive rhythm that made the audience feel too emotional or lazy, the judges could actually intervene. It was a competition where your artistic vision had to align with the city's survival. Winning a musical crown at Delphi gave you the same celebrity status as an Olympic sprinter. You would return to your home city as a hero. There are accounts of famous singers who were so wealthy and popular that they were treated like traveling diplomats. They wore purple robes, stayed in the best houses, and had statues built of them that lasted for centuries. This highlights a key Greek social rule. There was no distinction between jocks and nerds. To be a perfect citizen, you were expected to be able to both bench press your own weight and recite Homeric verses with professional timing. A man who was only an athlete was considered a brute, and a man who was only a poet was considered soft. The Pan-Hellenic circuit was designed to ensure no one became lopsided. In addition to the Olympics and the Pythian Games, the Big Four included the Nemean Games and the Isthmian Games. The Nemean Games were held in a valley dedicated to Zeus and featured many of the same brutal combat sports as the Olympics. But the prize was a crown of wild celery. The Isthmian Games, held near Corinth, were dedicated to Poseidon and were the most commercial of the festivals. Because Corinth was a major trade hub, these games were less about religious purity and more about the vibe. They were the spring break version of the games. Lots of tourists, lots of drinking, and lots of people trying to sell you sacred souvenirs. The social rule of the circuit was that athletes and performers would travel from one to the other, trying to achieve the ultimate title, periodontics. This was the grand slam of the ancient world. If you won at all 4 major games in one cycle, you were practically untouchable. You had achieved a level of fame that made you a political asset. Cities would fight over which one you belonged to, sometimes bribing athletes to change their citizenship just so the city could claim the win. It was the first instance of free agency in sports history, and it often led to massive scandals, lawsuits, and occasionally a small-scale war. There were also minor league games in almost every city-state. The Panathenaic Games in Athens were a massive local event where the prizes weren't just leafy crowns, but amphory large jars filled with high-quality olive oil, since olive oil was the liquid gold of the Mediterranean. Winning 50 or 100 of these jars was like winning a lottery. You could sell the oil for a fortune. This created a class of professional athletes who spent their entire lives traveling from city to city, picking up oil, celery, and glory wherever they could. One of the most unique Nanolympic events was the torch race, Lampeded Romea. This wasn't a solo sprint. It was a relay race where you had to carry a lit torch and pass it to your teammate without the flame going out. If the flame went out, your team was disqualified. It was a perfect metaphor for Greek social life. Speed was useless if you didn't have the discipline to protect the fire of the community. It emphasized teamwork in a culture that was otherwise obsessively focused on individual glory. The social rule of the spectator was also quite different from today. At these games, you weren't just a fan, you were a witness. The Greeks believed the gods were literally watching the games from the front row. Therefore, your behavior reflected on your city. If you were caught cheating or bribing a judge, your name was carved into a Zanes, a bronze statue of Zeus which was placed right at the entrance of the stadium. Every athlete who walked into the arena had to pass a line of these statues of shame, which listed the names of cheaters and their families. It was a permanent, physical cancellation that lasted for generations. So, while the Olympics gave us the template for physical competition, the Pythian and Isthmian games gave us the cultural circuit. They reminded the Greeks that a society without music was just a camp of soldiers, and a society without sports was just a room of talkers. By competing in everything from flute playing to chariot racing, they turned the entire Greek world into one giant, hyper-competitive, and very loud talent show. Since we've seen the Greeks compete for glory in both the stadium and the theater, it's time to address the management behind the whole operation, the gods. If you've read modern books or watched movies, you likely think of Greek mythology as a collection of bedtime stories about a dysfunctional family living on a mountain. But for a Greek citizen in 400 BC, Zeus, Hera, and Apollo weren't characters in a book. They were the unpredictable, high-powered landlords of the universe. The social rule of Greek religion was untubbered faith or being a good person. It was about eusebia piety, which essentially meant knowing how to follow the cosmic protocol so the gods wouldn't burn your house down. In the modern world, religion is often a private matter of the heart. In ancient Greece, religion was a series of public transactions. The Greeks practiced a system called doueute dei, I give so that you might give. It was a protection racket on a galactic scale. You didn't love Poseidon. You respected the fact that he could sink your ship. You didn't worship Ares because he was kind. You gave him a sacrifice because you didn't want him to favor the guy trying to stab you. The relationship was built on a foundation of mutual obligation and, frankly, a healthy amount of terror. First, let's look at the mythology versus cult divide. Myths were the stories poets told to explain why the world was the way it was. They were flexible, often contradictory, and served as entertainment. But cult was the actual practice of religion, the daily rituals that kept the city safe. A Greek could think a story about Zeus cheating on his wife was hilarious, but he would never dream of skipping a sacrifice to Zeus. The story didn't matter, the ritual did. To the Greeks, the gods weren't good or moral in a human sense. They were powerful. They were like fire, useful if managed correctly, but capable of destroying everything if you ignored the rules of the hearth. The primary social rule of reality religion was the sacrifice. This was the central act of Greek life. When a city-state held a festival, they didn't just pray, they killed. Usually, it was a bull, a sheep, or a goat. But there was a very specific cheat code in the ritual. According to myth, the Titan Prometheus tricked Zeus into accepting the worst parts of the animal, the fat and the bones wrapped in a tempting layer of skin, while the humans kept the delicious meat for themselves. This meant that every religious festival was essentially a giant, state-sponsored barbecue. You offered the smoke to the gods, and you fed the citizens. This reinforced the social bond. Religion was the thing that kept you fed and kept the community together. However, the gods were incredibly sensitive to miasma, spiritual pollution. If you committed a crime, touched a dead body, or even had a bad vibe, you were considered unclean. If you walked into a temple while polluted, you weren't just being rude. You were endangering the entire city. The Greeks believed that the gods didn't punish individuals as often as they punished collectives. If one man committed a sacrilege, the gods might send a plague to the whole town. This created an intense social pressure to police your neighbors. If you saw someone disrespecting a statue or skipping a ritual, you reported them not because you were a snitch, but because you didn't want to die of a mysterious fever next week. Then there was the issue of anthropomorphism. The Greeks made their gods look like humans, but supersized. They had the same flaws: envy, lust, anger, but with the power of a hurricane. This meant that dealing with a god was like dealing with a temperamental celebrity. You had to use the right titles. You couldn't just say, "Hey, Athena." You had to say, "Athena, shield-bearer, daughter of Zeus, lady of the city." If you used the wrong name, the message might not get through. This is why Greek prayers often sounded like legal contracts. If ever I have built a temple for you, or if ever I have burned the fat thighs of a bull, then grant me this wish. You were reminding the god of their debt to you. But what about the scary gods? In modern times, we think of Hades as a villain, like a Greek version of the devil. To the Greeks, Hades wasn't evil. He was just the guy in charge of the basement. He was Pluton, the rich one, because all the gold and grain came from the earth. But the social rule was that you didn't talk about him. You didn't build many temples to him. And you didn't name your kids after him. When you sacrificed to the Thanic underworld gods, you didn't do it on a high altar in the sun. You dug a hole in the ground at night and let the blood drain into the dirt. You didn't share the meat from those sacrifices. You burned the whole thing, Holocaust. You didn't want a relationship with the gods of the dead. You wanted them to stay where they were. The reality of Greek religion also included divination. Before any major decisions, starting a war, getting married, buying a slave, you had to check the divine weather. This wasn't a metaphor. You'd hire a mantis seer to look at the liver of a sacrificed sheep. If the liver was smooth and shiny, the gods were online and giving you a thumbs up. If it was shriveled or discolored, you canceled your plans. It sounds superstitious to us, but to a Greek general, attacking on a bad liver day was as strategically stupid as attacking a fortified hill without any shields. It was a data-driven decision, even if the data was goat guts. The most famous version of this was the oracle at Delphi. People traveled for months to ask the Pythia a question. The social rule was that the gods never gave a straight answer. When King Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle said, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." He attacked, and the empire that fell was his own. The Greeks believed the gods spoke in riddles to test human intelligence and humility. If you misinterpreted the god, it was your fault, not the gods. It was the ultimate terms and conditions clause. Finally, we have to talk about the statues. To a Greek, a cult statue wasn't just art, it was a landing pad for the god's essence. When they washed the statue of Athena and dressed it in a new robe during the Panathenaic festival, they weren't playing house, they were maintaining the physical presence of their protector. If a statue was stolen, the city felt it had lost its soul. This is why Greek art is so incredibly detailed. You weren't trying to impress a critic. You were trying to make a body beautiful enough that a god would actually want to inhabit it for a while. So, the next time you read a myth about Zeus turning into a swan, or Poseidon getting angry at an Odyssey, remember the reality for the person on the ground. For them, the gods were a constant, invisible, and very dangerous bureaucracy. You didn't need to believe in them, you just had to make sure you paid your taxes in blood and wine on time. Or the landlord might decide it was time for an eviction. Since we've seen the landlords of the universe and the blood-soaked altars they required, it's time to look at the massive marble luxury suites the Greeks built for them. If you walk through a modern city like Washington, D.C., London, or Paris, you'll see buildings that look like Greek temples. We call this neoclassical, and we use it for banks and courthouses because it looks solid, serious, and eternal. But to an ancient Greek, a temple wasn't a bank. It was a high-tech, brightly colored, mathematical miracle designed to trick the human eye into seeing perfection where none actually existed. The social rule of sacred architecture was that the temple was not for the people. Unlike a modern church, mosque, or synagogue, you didn't go inside a Greek temple to pray. The interior, the cella, was the god's private bedroom, reserved for the massive cult statue and the god's personal treasures. All the action, the sacrifices, the cheering, the blood, happened outside at the altar. The building itself was a backdrop, a giant marble billboard proclaiming the wealth and arete of the city. If your neighbor built a temple with 20 columns, you built one with 24. It was a 5th century BC skyscraper race. But the real genius of Greek architecture lay in optical refinements. The Greeks realized a fundamental, annoying truth about the human brain. Our eyes lie to us. If you build a perfectly straight column, it looks like it's sagging in the middle. If you build a perfectly horizontal floor, it looks like it's dipping. To fix this, the Greeks used a technique called entasis. They built their columns with a slight bulge, about 1/3 of the way up. It's almost invisible to the naked eye, but it makes the column look perfectly straight and under tension, like a muscle flexing under the weight of the roof. The Parthenon in Athens is the ultimate example of this perfectly crooked design. There isn't a single straight line in the entire building. The floor is slightly curved upward in the center. The columns lean inward by a few inches. Even the architrave is bowed. If you projected the lines of the Parthenon's columns upward, they would all meet at a single point several miles in the sky. The Greeks didn't build a box. They built a mathematical curve that fooled the brain into seeing a box. This was the social rule of aesthetics. Beauty wasn't just about symmetry. It was about the intellectual mastery of geometry over the flawed human senses. Now, let's talk about the orders. To a Greek, picking a style for your temple was like picking a personality. You had three main choices. The Doric order. This was the Spartan of architecture. It was thick, heavy, and had no base. The columns sat directly on the floor. Atop the Capitol was a plain, circular stone. It screamed strength, masculinity, and old money. This was the style of the Parthenon. It was for cities that wanted to look like they'd been there forever and were ungoing anywhere. The Ionic order. This was the sophisticated style. The columns were thinner, sat on a decorative base, and the capitals featured volutes, those curly, scroll-like shapes that look like ram's horns. It was considered feminine and graceful. It was popular in the wealthy cities of Asia Minor and for smaller, more elegant temples in Athens. The Corinthian order. This was the flashy style. The capitals were covered in ornate acanthus leaves. In the classical period, the Greeks actually thought this was too much and rarely used it on the outside of buildings. It was like wearing a tuxedo to a backyard barbecue. It only became the standard later when the Romans took over and decided that more is more. The social rule of the construction site was also a feat of organization. These weren't built by slaves alone. They were built by highly skilled, highly paid, free craftsmen. We have the expense reports for the Parthenon carved into stone. They listed exactly how much was spent on marble from Mount Pentelicus, how much the crane operators were paid, and how much gold was used for the statue of Athena. It was a massive public works project designed to keep the economy moving. If the city was at peace, you built a temple to keep the masons, sculptors, and laborers from getting restless. But here is the detail that would shock a modern tourist. The temples were not white. Today, we see bleached, ghostly marble and think elegant minimalism. But to an ancient Greek, a white temple would have looked unfinished or cheap. They were painted in garish, vibrant colors. The backgrounds of the friezes were deep blue. The statues were painted with realistic skin tones, red lips, and golden hair. The triglyphs were bright red. A Greek temple in its prime looked less like a somber monument and more like a high-end comic book or a Las Vegas casino. They wanted their gods to live in a world of technicolor, not a world of gray shadows. And then there were the caryatides. Sometimes the Greeks decided that regular columns were too boring, so they replaced them with statues of women. The most famous are on the Erechtheion in Athens. These women aren't just standing there, they are bearing the weight of the city. It's a powerful architectural metaphor, the virtuous woman as the literal pillar of society. Of course, the irony was that while these stone women held up the roof of the most sacred buildings, the actual women of Athens were, as we've seen, largely barred from participating in the public life that happened beneath that roof. Finally, we have to talk about the frieze. Running around the top of the temple was a continuous comic strip of carved marble. These depicted scenes of gods fighting giants, heroes slaying monsters, or in the case of the Parthenon, the people of the city themselves in a grand procession. This was the social rule of legacy. By carving your image into the stone of the god's house, you were making yourself part of the divine story. You were saying, we were here, we were wealthy, and we were the favorites of the gods. So, the next time you see a Greek-style building, look closely. Check for the bulge in the columns. Imagine it painted in screaming reds and blues. And remember that, for the Greeks, a temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was a 20,000-ton mathematical argument that their city was the center of the universe. It was a perfect illusion built by people who knew exactly how to trick you into believing in their greatness. Since we've seen the luxury suites of the gods and the bright mathematical perfection of the temples, it's time to head back into the shadows. While the temples were for the Olympian gods who lived in the sky, there was another set of social rules for the chthonic gods, the ones who lived in the basement. Sometimes a good liver sacrifice or a polite prayer wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed to speak to someone who was already on the other side. This led the Greeks to the necromantian, the oracle of the dead. The social rule of the necromantian was total sensory deprivation. Unlike the oracle at Delphi, where you just stood in a temple and listened to a priestess, visiting the oracle of the dead was a psychological endurance test. The most famous one was located in Epirus, near the river Acheron, one of the literal rivers of the underworld. If you wanted to ask your dead father where he hid the family silver, or if you were a general like Odysseus trying to find out if you'd ever make it home, you didn't just walk in. You entered a liminal space where the boundary between life and death was intentionally blurred. First, you underwent a ritual isolation. The seeker was locked in a dark, windowless room for several days. You were put on a specific diet of soul food, barley, broad beans, and lupins. To the Greeks, these foods were associated with the dead because they were thought to cause gas and vivid, heavy dreams. You were essentially being primed for a hallucination. You weren't allowed to see the sun, and you weren't allowed to speak to anyone except the priests. By the time you were ready for the consultation, your brain was a mess of hunger, darkness, and superstition. Then came the labyrinth. The priests would lead you through a series of winding, pitch-black corridors. These weren't just for atmosphere. They were designed to disorient you so completely that you lost all sense of direction. The social rule of the initiate was to follow the priest's voice in the dark. Eventually, you would reach a massive, vaulted, underground chamber. This was the heart of the dead. Here, the priests used mechanical, tricks-hidden pulleys and bronze cranes to make ghostly shadows, or even physical apparitions, appear in the flickering torchlight. To a man who had been sitting in the dark, eating beans for 3 days, these weren't special effects. They were literal ghosts. But the social rule of the ghost was that they were blood-hungry. In the Odyssey, Homer describes how the dead are just witless shades until they drink the blood of a fresh sacrifice. To get the dead to talk, you had to perform a libation of blood. You'd slaughter a black ram over a pit and let the blood drain down. Only after the ghost had drunk would it regain its memory and voice. The Greeks believed that the dead were essentially rechargeable batteries of information, and blood was the electricity that turned them back on. This brings us to the social ethics of necromancy. While the state supported the great oracles like Delphi, private necromants, hiring a freelance witch or a ghost binder to summon spirits in a graveyard, was seen as socially sketchy. It was the dark web of Greek religion. If you were caught doing it, people assumed you were up to no good. Why would you want to wake the dead unless you were trying to curse someone or find a shortcut to power? It violated the Greek sense of Sufrasine moderation and self-control. You were supposed to respect the boundary between the upper world and the lower world. Crossing it was an act of hubris. Interestingly, the necromantian also served as a form of ancient grief counseling. In a world with high mortality rates, many people were left with unfinished business. The ritual of the oracle allowed a person to see their loved one last time, say what needed to be said, and then seal the door back to the living world. The priests would lead the seeker back out through the labyrinth, and there was a final social rule: you must never look back. Just like the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, looking back was a sign that you hadn't truly accepted the death. By exiting the temple and walking back into the sunlight, you were socially and psychologically re-entering the world of the living. But what about the technical side? Archaeologists, at the site of the Epirus Necromantian, found something fascinating: massive bronze gears and weights. It appears the priests were the world's first haunted house designers. They used these gears to lower ghosts from the ceiling, or to make doors swing open with terrifying speed. The social rule of the priesthood was to maintain the illusion of the divine. They weren't necessarily trying to scam people. They believed that by using these tools, they were facilitating a genuine spiritual experience. They were the stage managers of the afterlife. We also have to talk about the psychopomps. These were the guides of souls. Hermes was the most famous one. He was the only god besides Hades and Persephone who could move freely between the two worlds. When you visited a necromantian, you prayed to Hermes to unlock the gate. The social rule was that you didn't just summon a ghost. You requested it through the proper channels. It was a bureaucracy of the dead. You needed a permit, a sacrifice, and a divine escort. Finally, why lead? As we saw in the Curse Tablets section, lead was the metal of the dead. At the necromantian, seekers would often leave votive offerings made of lead or clay. These were physical reminders of their visit. Some of these offerings were shaped like body parts, suggesting that people also went there to ask the dead to heal their living bodies. It was the ultimate second opinion. If the living doctors couldn't fix your leg, maybe your great-grandfather's ghost had a suggestion. So, the next time you feel like the world is a bit too rational or scientific, remember the necromantian. Remember the men walking in circles in the dark, the smell of blood and broad beans, and the bronze gears grinding in the ceiling to bring a shadow to life. For the Greeks, death wasn't a wall. It was a heavy bronze door that could be opened if you were brave enough to handle the disorientation and the hunger of the shades. Since we've survived the sensory deprivation tanks and mechanical ghosts of the necromantian, it's time to expand our horizons. For the Greeks, staying in one place was never the plan. If you looked at a map of the Mediterranean in 500 BC, you wouldn't see one giant country called Greece. Instead, you'd see what the philosopher Plato described as frogs around a pond. The Greeks were a maritime people, and when a city-state became too crowded, too politically unstable, or too hungry, they didn't just build taller apartment buildings. They packed a ship, took a sacred fire from their home hearth, and sailed off to start a franchise. This brings us to the colonies and Magna Graecia. The social rule of Greek colonization was not conquest, but cloning. When a group of settlers left a mother city metropolis, they weren't trying to build something new or find themselves. They were trying to recreate the exact city they had just left, only better and with more room for activities. They took the same gods, the same laws, the same architectural orders, and the same obsessive need to argue in an agora. This is why, if you were an Athenian traveler landing in Sicily or southern Italy, you wouldn't feel like you were in a foreign land. You'd see the same Doric columns, hear the same Homeric dialects, and find the same naked guys wrestling in a gymnasium. First, let's talk about the oikist. This was the founder of the colony, and his social status was legendary. Before a colony was sent out, the metropolis would consult the oracle at Delphi. The oracle would give a cryptic direction, like build where the deer drinks salt water. The oikist was the man responsible for interpreting that riddle and leading the expedition. If the colony succeeded, the oikist was treated like a demigod. When he died, he was usually buried in the center of the new city's agora, the only person allowed to be buried inside the city walls. He became the sacred ancestor of the new community, the man who turned a wilderness into a civilization. The most successful cloning project was in southern Italy and Sicily, an area so packed with Greek cities that the Romans later called it Magna Graecia, Great Greece. Cities like Syracuse, Tarentum, and Sybaris didn't just copy the motherland, they often outdid it. Because they had more land and more resources, the colonial Greeks became fabulously wealthy. This led to a new social rule, the luxury standard. In the old country, the Greeks prided themselves on sophrosyne moderation, but in the colonies, specifically in the city of Sybaris, they threw moderation out the window. The Sybarites became world famous for their decadence. They supposedly banned blacksmiths and roosters from the city so that no loud noises would wake them up. They were the first to invent patents for chefsif. A cook created a new, delicious dish. No one else was allowed to make it for a year. The term Sybarite still means someone devoted to luxury today. For the Greeks back in Athens or Sparta, the colonies were like the Wild West. Wealthy, flashy, and a little bit embarrassing, like a younger brother who made a fortune in tech and started wearing too many gold chains. But colonization wasn't just about eating well. It was a social safety valve. If a city-state was on the verge of a civil war between the rich and the poor, the easiest solution was to take the most annoying, rebellious people, put them on a boat, and tell them to go be kings of somewhere else. This kept the metropolis stable. However, the social rule was that the colony was independent but connected. A colony didn't pay taxes to its mother city, and it didn't take orders from it. But if the mother city was attacked, the colony was expected to send ships. It was a family obligation, not a legal one. Breaking this bond was seen as a horrific filial sin, the geopolitical equivalent of punching your own mother in the face. Of course, we have to talk about the neighbors. The Greeks weren't landing on empty islands. They were landing in places already occupied by barbarians, the Greek word for anyone who didn't speak Greek. The social rule for dealing with locals was usually displace or assimilate. In some places, like southern Italy, the Greeks and the local Italics eventually blended their cultures. In other places, like North Africa or the Black Sea, the Greeks built massive walls and lived in a bubble of Greekness, surrounded by people they viewed as uncivilized. This led to the creation of the Emporion. Not every colony was a full city. Some were just trading posts. An Emporion was like a duty-free zone where Greeks and locals could swap wine and olive oil for grain, furs, and slaves. These posts were the internet of the ancient world. They allowed ideas to travel as fast as goods. It was through these colonial outposts that the Greeks infected the rest of the world with their alphabet, their art, and their obsession with wine-drinking etiquette. The Romans, the Etruscans, and the Celts all started looking a bit more Greek because they wanted the cool stuff the colonial frogs were selling at the edge of the pond. The social life in these colonies was also a melting pot of religious innovation. Because they were far from the traditional temples of the motherland, colonial Greeks were more open to mixing their gods with local ones. In Sicily, you might find a temple to a Greek god that had borrowed some traits from a Carthaginian deity. This was the Hellenization process in its early stages. The Greek culture was like a universal language that people adapted to fit their own needs. It was the beginning of a globalized world, 2,500 years before the term was invented. However, the Great Greece Project eventually ran into a wall. The rise of Rome and Carthage. As the colonies grew richer, they became targets. The social rule of the motherland was that if a colony was in trouble, they'd send a general. But as the centuries wore on, the colonies in the West found themselves caught between two massive, non-Greek superpowers. Eventually, the clones would be absorbed into the Roman Empire, but they had the last laugh. They had spent so much time cloning Greek culture that when the Romans finally conquered them, the Romans looked around and said, "Actually, this is much better than our stuff," and proceeded to copy-paste Greek culture onto themselves. So, the next time you see a Little Italy or a Chinatown, think of the Greeks. They were the pioneers of the cultural enclave. They proved that you don't need an army to conquer a world. You just need a sacred fire, a very specific way of building a porch, and a refusal to stop talking about your gods. The Greek colonies were the first global franchises, and their brand was so strong that we're still buying it today. Since we've seen the Greeks spreading their culture like a successful Mediterranean franchise, it is time to look at the dark side of that maritime expansion. While the frogs around the pond were busy trading wine and philosophy, the pond itself was a lawless frontier. In ancient Greece, the sea was not just a highway, it was a hunting ground. The social rule of the high seas was simple. If you were in protected by a powerful navy or a sacred treaty, you weren't a passenger, you were cargo. This brings us to the terrifying reality of piracy and the high seas. In the modern world, we think of pirates as fictional characters with parrots and wooden legs, or as a remote threat in specific shipping lanes. In the Greek world, piracy was a legitimate, if disreputable, career choice. In fact, in the early days of Grista era of Homer, there was no social stigma attached to asking a stranger, "Are you a merchant or a pirate?" It was seen as a fair question, like asking someone if they were a contractor or a freelancer. If you had a fast ship and a hungry crew, raiding a coastal village was just aggressive harvesting. The primary social rule of the sea was the lack of international law. Today, we have the law of the sea and territorial waters. In 450 BC, once you were out of sight of your city's harbor, you were in a state of nature. Your safety depended entirely on your ship speed and your crew's ability to row until their lungs burned. Pirates didn't just want your olive oil and grain, they wanted you. The most profitable commodity in the Mediterranean was human beings. A single successful raid on a merchant vessel could net a pirate crew a dozen healthy medics or citizens who could be sold at the next slave market for a massive profit. For a Greek traveler, every sail on the horizon was a source of intense anxiety. If the approaching ship was a Hemiolia light, fast galley with a 1.5 bank of orzu, knew you were in trouble. These ships were the Ferraris of the pirate world. They were designed specifically to be fast enough to catch a heavy merchant, round ship and light enough to be hauled onto a beach to hide from a pursuing navy. The social rule of the merchant was to travel in convoys whenever possible, but even then, a determined pirate fleet could pick off the laggards. The most famous victims of piracy were often the most high-profile. Even Julius Caesar was famously kidnapped by Cilician pirates, though that was later in history. The business model was the same. In the Greek era, if a wealthy citizen was captured, the pirates wouldn't sell them immediately. They would hold them for ransom. This created a weird, high-stakes social negotiation. The pirates would send a message to the captive's home city, demanding a specific amount of silver. If the city paid, the captive was returned. If they didn't, the captive was sold into the silver mines of Lorien, which, as we've seen, was a one-way trip to the underworld. This leads us to the social rule of the Lycos wolf. This was the nickname for the pirate captains who operated out of the jagged coastlines of Crete, Cilicia, and the countless small islands of the Aegean. These areas were pirate republics before the term existed. The geography of Greece, with its thousands of hidden coves and mountain-shielded bays, was a paradise for hit-and-run tactics. A pirate could raid a ship off the coast of Attica and be vanished into a labyrinth of islands before the Athenian navy could even launch their triremes. However, the superpower cities like Athens eventually realized that piracy was bad for the bottom line. Athens built the greatest navy in the world, not just for war, but for policing the sea. The social rule of the Athenian Empire was, we keep the sea safe from pirates, and in exchange, you pay us protection money, tribute. If a city-state refused to pay, Athens would let the pirates return. Or worse, they would act like the pirates themselves. The line between a legitimate navy and a pirate fleet was often just a matter of who was holding the paperwork. An Athenian trireme collecting taxes from a small island looked an awful lot like a pirate raid to the people on the ground. There was also a deep religious fear associated with the sea. The Greeks believed the ocean was the domain of Poseidon, a god who was famously salty and prone to mood swings. If a ship was attacked by pirates, the victims often assumed it was divine punishment for some miasma or ritual mistake. Conversely, pirates had their own religious social rules. They would often dedicate a portion of their booty to local shrines of Hermes, the god of thieves, or Poseidon. It was a world where everyone was trying to bribe the same gods for opposite outcomes. One of the most terrifying aspects of sea travel was the wrecking industry. In some coastal communities, the social rule was to wait for a storm to blow a merchant ship onto the rocks. Instead of helping the survivors, the locals would kill them and strip the wreck. This was considered the gift of the sea. To combat this, the Greeks developed the concept of asilia inviolability. A city could grant asilia to a person or another city, meaning we promise not to rob or kidnap you. It was the first step toward international diplomacy, born out of the absolute necessity of not being murdered while trying to sell some pottery. The social life of a pirate was also a bizarre mirror of the Greek city-state. On a pirate ship, everything was shared. They practiced a form of radical democracy out of necessity. If the captain didn't lead them to profit, the crew would simply find a new wolf. This stood in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchies of the home cities. For a poor man with no land and no future, the life of a pirate offered a social mobility that the agora never could even, if that mobility usually ended at the end of a spear or at the bottom of the sea. So, the next time you look at a beautiful, calm photo of the Aegean Sea, imagine it through the eyes of an ancient Greek merchant. Imagine the constant scanning of the horizon for a light, two-banked galley. Imagine the ransom insurance you'd have to arrange before leaving home. And remember that for all the civilization of the Golden Age, the sea remained a place where the only rule was might makes right, and where your freedom was only as secure as the wind in your sails and the strength of your rowers' arms. Since we've survived the lawless waters of the Aegean and the wolves of the sea, it's time to turn our eyes north toward the mountains. For centuries, the sophisticated residents of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes looked at the region of Macedonia with a mix of pity and snobbery. To a civilized Greek, the Macedonians were the embarrassing country cousins who lived in the woods, wore animal skins, and hadn't quite mastered the concept of a city-state. But the social rules of the North were being forged in a much harder fire, and soon those barbaric cousins would walk south and change the Greek world forever. This brings us to the Macedonians. The primary social rule that separated a Macedonian from an Athenian was the concept of basileia kingship. In the south, the Greeks had spent centuries experimenting with democracies, oligarchies, and tyrants. They believed that no one man should be above the law. But in Macedonia, the king was everything. However, he wasn't a distant golden-crowned god-king like the emperors of Persia. A Macedonian king was a first among peers. He was expected to lead the charge in battle, drink the hardest at the feast, and personally hunt lions in the forest. If a king became too soft or too civilized, his own generals would likely murder him. It was a brutal, meritocratic monarchy where the crown was only as secure as the sword that defended it. One of the biggest social scandals the South had with the North was the drinking culture. As we saw in the section on the symposium, the proper Greek way to drink wine was to mix it with water. Drinking wine neat unmixed was considered a sign of a barbarian who could uncontrol his animal impulses. The Macedonians, however, laughed at this. They drank their wine straight in massive quantities, and their feasts often ended in bloody brawls or accidental assassinations. To an Athenian, a Macedonian dinner party looked like a riot. To a Macedonian, an Athenian dinner party looked like a boring lecture. This cultural gap created a deep sense of otherness that the Macedonians would eventually use as fuel for their conquest. Then came Philip II, the man who turned a backwater kingdom into a superpower. Philip understood a social rule that the southern Greeks had forgotten: innovation wins wars. While the Greeks were still using the traditional hoplite phalanx with 8-foot spears, Philip redesigned his infantry. He gave them the sarissa massive, 18-foot-long pike made of tough cornel wood. Because the pike was so long, the first 5 ranks of the Macedonian phalanx could all point their spears at the enemy at once, creating a porcupine of bronze that was physically impossible to get past. By the time a traditional Spartan hoplite got close enough to use his spear, he had already been poked 5 times by a Macedonian who was standing 20 feet away. But Philip didn't just change the spear. He changed the social status of the soldier. In Athens, you were a citizen soldier who wanted to get back to your farm. In Macedonia, Philip created a professional standing army. He called his elite infantry the Pesitoroi foot companions, and his elite cavalry the Heteroi companions. By giving them these titles, he made them feel like they were part of his inner circle. He turned war into a full-time career with benefits, promotions, and a direct line to the king. This loyalty was something the fractured, argumentative city-states of the South couldn't match. The social rule of the Macedonian court was also a hotbed of polygamy and intrigue. Unlike the Greeks, who generally had one wife, Macedonian kings married for diplomacy. Philip had 7 wives, all from different tribes and kingdoms he had conquered or allied with. This created a nightmare of social ranking among the queens and their children. Every time a king died, there was a Game of Thrones-style bloodbath to see which son would take the throne. This was the environment that produced Alexander the Great. He grew up in a world where his mother, Olympias, was constantly whispering that he was a god, while his father's other wives were plotting his accidental death. It made him hard, ambitious, and incredibly paranoid. When Philip finally turned his army south, the Greeks tried to resist. The orator Demosthenes gave famous speeches called the Philippics Warning. Athens, that Philip was a barbarian who was going to steal their freedom, but the social rules had shifted. The age of the independent city-state was over. At the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip and a young Alexander crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Instead of destroying the cities, Philip forced them into the League of Corinth. The social rule was now peace through subjection. You kept your city, you kept your gods, but Philip was the hegemon, the boss. One of the most interesting Macedonian social rules was their relationship with Greekness. They desperately wanted to be seen as Greek. They competed in the Olympics. They invited Greek poets like Euripides to their court, and Philip hired the philosopher Aristotle to be Alexander's personal tutor. It was the ultimate imposter syndrome. They conquered the Greeks physically, but they surrendered to them culturally. They wanted the sophistication of Athens, but they wanted to keep the hardness of the north. This hybrid culture, Macedonian muscle and Greek brains, is what would eventually march across the world. The Macedonians also brought a different social rule regarding the hunt. In the south, hunting was a sport. In the north, it was a rite of passage. A Macedonian man was often not allowed to sit at the table with the other men until he had killed a wild boar with a spear, without a net. He wasn't allowed to wear a specific belt until he had killed his first man in battle. This created a society of elite, hyper-aggressive alpha males who viewed the southern Greeks as perfumed talkers. So, as we prepare to follow Alexander into Asia, remember where he came from. He wasn't a product of the calm, white marble philosophy of Athens. He was a product of the muddy, wine-soaked, pike-bristling world of Macedonia. He was a king who was expected to lead from the front, a student of Aristotle who knew how to knead his wine, and a commander of a professional army that looked at the traditional Greek phalanx as a relic of the past. The cousins had arrived, and they were about to burn the old map of the world. The social rule of the final Greek century was one of sophisticated irrelevance. By 146 BC, the independent city-states like Athens and Sparta were no longer world powers. They were more like university towns or museums. If you were a wealthy Roman teenager, you didn't go to Athens to fight. You went there for a gap year. You went to study under a philosopher, to see the quaint old statues, and to learn how to speak with a proper Greek accent. The Greeks had lost their military arete, but they had gained a different kind of power, cultural hegemony. They had become the teachers of their conquerors. First, we must talk about the social rule of the Graeculos. This was a derogatory term used by the Romans, meaning little Greek. It described the way the Romans viewed their Greek neighbors, as brilliant, artistic, and clever, but also as shifty, talkative, and physically weak. To the Romans, the Greeks were the consultants of the ancient world. If you needed a doctor, a tutor, an architect, or a chef, you hired a Greek. The social hierarchy had flipped. The descendants of the men who stood at Marathon were now the household staff of Roman senators. But there was a secret pride in this. The Greeks knew that while the Romans held the swords, the Greeks held the ideas. The social life of this era was centered around the great library of Alexandria. This was the backup drive of the ancient world. For the first time, the social rule wasn't just to produce new ideas, but to categorize the old ones. Scholars in Alexandria spent their lives collecting every scroll they could find, standardizing the text of Homer, and arguing over grammar. They were the ones who decided what was classical and what was trash. This was the birth of the canon. Without these librarians, we wouldn't have the plays of Sophocles or the theories of Euclid. They turned Greek culture into a portable package that could survive even if the cities themselves burned. But the real end of the Greek social experiment happened at the sack of Corinth in 146 BC. The Romans, tired of the Greeks' constant bickering and legal maneuvering, decided to make an example. They leveled the city of Corinth to the ground, sold the survivors into slavery, and shipped the city's priceless art back to Rome. This was a social shock to the Greek system. It was the moment they realized that their cleverness and their history could unsave them from a legion of soldiers who did uncare about the Socratic method. The era of the city-state was officially dead, replaced by the era of the province. However, as the Roman poet Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror and brought the arts to rustic Latium." This is the ultimate social rule of the Greek legacy. The Romans didn't just conquer Greece, they absorbed it. They took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus. They took Greek architecture and added the arch and the dome. They took Greek philosophy, especially Stoicism, and turned it into a manual for Roman leadership. The social life of a Greek in the Roman Empire was one of cosmopolitanism. You were no longer just a man of Athens. You were a citizen of the world. The Greek language coin became the lingua franca of the entire Mediterranean. It was the language of science, the language of the elite, and eventually the language of a new, growing religion called Christianity. The social rules of the agora, the need to debate, the obsession with rhetoric, and the focus on logos became the foundation of the Western mind. The Greeks had failed to stay a country, but they had succeeded in becoming a mindset. As we look back, from the humors of the body to the lead tablets of the dead, we see a culture that was obsessed with competition, geometry, and humanity. The Greeks were the first people to look at a mountain and see a challenge to climb, rather than just a home for a god. They were the first to look at a government and ask why, rather than just how much do I owe. Their social rules were often brutal, exclusionary, and contradictory. But they were the first rules written by people who believed that man is the measure of all things. Today, we still live by their rules. When you go to a theater, you are sitting in a space designed by the Greeks. When you vote, you are participating in a Greek experiment. When you use a vending machine or watch an Olympic event or use logic to win an argument, you are speaking a language that was perfected in the dusty, olive-scented streets of a world that ended 2,000 years ago. The Greeks didn't leave behind a unified country, but they left behind a blueprint. They proved that a small group of argumentative, oiled-up, and fiercely curious people could create a social code that would outlast their empires, their temples, and even their gods. We began this journey by being licked by a temple snake in an attempt to cure a headache. We ended by realizing that the headache of the human condition, the need to know who we are and where we are going, was first diagnosed, debated, and documented by the Greeks. They were the ones who dared to turn the lights on in the room of human consciousness, and for better or worse, we have been living in that light ever since. The tour is over. The sacred fire of the hearth has been passed to you. Whether you use it to light a temple, power a steam engine, or just to read a book by the shore of the pond, you are now part of the franchise.